Chapter 24 of the English Orphans, or A Home in the New World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Laura Luchsinger. The English Orphans, or A Home in the New World, by Mary Jane Holmes. Chapter 24. A Change of Opinion. "Oh, Mother, won't you take this pillow from my head, and put another blanket on my feet, and fix the fire, and give me some water or something? Oh, dear, dear," groaned poor Rose Lincoln, as with aching head and lungs she did penance for her imprudence in crossing the wet, slippery street in thin slippers and silken hose. Mrs. Lincoln, who knew nothing of this exposure, loudly lamented the extreme delicacy of her daughter's constitution, imputing it wholly to Mount Holyoke discipline, and wishing, as she had often done before, that she'd been wise and kept her at home. Jenny would have wished so too, if by this means Rose's illness could have been avoided, for it was not a very agreeable task to stay in that close sick-room, listening to the complaints of her fault-finding sister, who tossed and turned and fretted, from morning until night, sometimes wishing herself dead, and then crying because she wanted something and didn't know what. "Oh dear," said she, one evening several days after the commencement of her illness, "how provoking to be obliged to lie here moping with the dullest of all dull company, when there's Mrs. Russell's party next week, and I've such a lovely dress to wear. Why ain't I as strong and healthy as you? Though I wouldn't be so fat for anything." Jenny knew that whatever answer she could make would not be the right one, so she said nothing, and after a moment Rose again spoke. "I'll go to that party, sick or well. I wouldn't miss of it for anything." This time Jenny looked up in surprise, asking why her sister was so particularly anxious to attend the party. "Because," returned Rose, "Mary Howard will be there, and you know as well as I how awkward she'll appear. Never was in any kind of society in her life." "I don't see what inducement that can be for you to expose your health," said Jenny, and Rose continued, "I went to see Ida mortified once, for she might know better than to bring a green country girl here, setting her up as something wonderful, and expecting everybody to believe it just because Miss Selden said so. Didn't you tell me there was someone continually going to inquire after Mary?" "Yes," answered Jenny, whereupon Rose got very angry, complaining that no one called upon her except that little simpleton Ella, who only came when she thought there was a chance of seeing Henry. "Seems to me you've changed your mind with regard to Ella," said Jenny. "No, I hain't either," answered Rose. "I always thought her silly, and now she hangs around Henry so much I'm thoroughly disgusted. But see, there's Henry now at Mr. Selden's gate with another gentleman." The moon was shining brightly, and looking out, Jenny saw Billy Bender and her brother mounting the steps which led to Mr. Selden's door. "It's funny that they should be together," thought she, while Rose continued, "Nothing will surprise me now if Henry has got to running after her. I am glad George Morland is away, though I fancy he's too much good sense to swallow a person, just because Ida and his old maid aunt say he must." Here the conversation was interrupted by the entrance of Mr. Lincoln, who came as usual to see his daughter. In the meantime, the two young men, who accidentally met at the gate, had entered Mr. Selden's parlor and inquired for the young ladies. "Come, you must go down," said Ida to Mary when the message was delivered. "This is the third time Mr. Bender has called, and you have no excuse for not now seeing him. By the way," she continued, as Mary said something about Billy, "don't call him Billy. We know him as Mr. Bender, and Billy is so countrified," suggested Mary. "Yes, countrified, if you please," returned Ida. "So after this he is William. Haven't you noticed that Jenny calls him so? But come," she added mischievously, "never mind brushing your hair. Mr. Stewart isn't down there." With the exception of the time when she was hurt, Mary had not seen William for more than 2 years and a half, and now when she met him, she was so much embarrassed that she greeted him with a reserve amounting almost to coldness. He, on the contrary, was perfectly self-possessed, but after a few commonplace remarks, he seated himself on the opposite side of the room and entered into conversation with Mrs. Mason concerning Chicopee and its inhabitants. Frequently, Mary's eyes rested upon him, and she felt a thrill of pride when she saw how much his residence in Boston had improved him, and how handsome he really was. But any attempt to converse with him was rendered impossible by Henry Lincoln, who, toady as he was, thought proper to be exceedingly polite to Mary, now that the Seldens noticed her so much. Seating himself by her side with all the familiarity of an old friend, and laying his arm across the back of the sofa so that to William it looked as if thrown around her shoulders, he commenced a tirade of nonsense as meaningless as it was disagreeable. More than once, too, he managed to let fall a very pointed compliment, feeling greatly surprised to see with what indifference it was received. "Confound the girl," thought he, beginning to feel piqued at her coldness. "Is she made of ice or what?" And then he redoubled his efforts at flattery, until Mary, quite disgusted, begged leave to change her seat, saying, by way of apology, that she was getting too warm. In the course of the evening, George Morland was mentioned. Involuntarily, Mary blushed, and Henry, who was watching her, proposed that she resume her former seat, "For," said he, "you look quite as warm and red where you are." "The nearest I ever knew him come to anything witty," whispered Ida from behind a fire-screen. "I do believe you've rubbed up his ideas, and I predict that you win him instead of Ella." Mary did not even smile, for to her there was something revolting in the idea of being even teased about Henry, who was conceited enough to attribute her reserve to the awe which he fancied his elegant presence inspired. If Ella, with all her wealth and beauty, placed an invaluable estimate upon his attentions, why should not her unpretending sister be equally in love with him? And though the young dandy stroked his mustache with his white fingers and wondered what Ella Campbell would say if she knew how much her sister admired him and how very nearly his admiration was returned. At length William arose to go, and advancing towards Mary, he took her hand, saying in a low tone, with marked emphasis on the word sister, "I find my sister greatly changed and improved since I last saw her." "And you too are changed," returned Mary, her eyes filling with tears, for William's manner was not as of old. "Yes, in more respects than one," said he, "but I shall see you again. Do you attend Mrs. Russell's party?" Mary replied in the affirmative, and the next moment he was gone. Half an hour after, Henry, too, departed, saying to Mary as he went out, "You mustn't fail to be at Mrs. Russell's, for I shall only go for the sake of seeing you. Truth, upon my honor, what little I have," he continued, as Mary's eyes flashed forth her entire disbelief of what he said. "I am in earnest now, if I never was before." Ida laughed aloud at the mystified picture which Mary's face presented as the door closed upon Henry. "You are too much of a novice to see through everything, but you'll learn in time that opinions frequently change with circumstances," said she. That night, in his chamber, with his heels upon the marble mantel, and his box of cigars and bottle of brandy at his side, the man of fashion soliloquized as follows: "Zounds, how that girl has improved! Never saw the like in my life. Talk about family and rank and all that stuff. Why, there isn't a lady in Boston that begins to have the air distingué which Mary Howard has. Of course she'll be all the go. Everything the Seldens take up is. Ain't I glad Morland is in New Orleans, for with his notions he wouldn't hesitate to marry her if he liked her, poor as she is. Now, if she only had the chink, I'd walk up to her quick. I don't see why the deuce the old man need to have got so involved just now as to make it necessary for me either to work or have a rich wife. Such eyes, too, as Mary's got. Black and fiery one minute, blue and soft the next. Well, anyway, I'll have a good time flirting with her, just for the sake of seeing Ella wince and whimper, if nothing more. Bah! What a simpleton she is, compared with Mary. I wonder how much Mrs. Campbell is worth, and if Ella will have it all." And the young man retired to dream of debts liquidated by the gold which a marriage with Ella Campbell would bring him. End of Chapter 24. Chapter 25 of the English Orphans, or A Home in the New World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Laura Luchsinger. Chapter 25. The Party. "Bring me my new dress, Jenny. I want to see if the Honiton lace on the caps is as wide as Ida Selden's." "What do you mean?" asked Jenny, turning quickly towards her sister, whose white, wasted face looked fitter for a shroud than a gay party dress. "I mean what I say," returned Rose. "I'm not going to be cooped up here any longer. I'm going to the party tomorrow night, if I never go again." "Why, Rose Lincoln, are you crazy?" asked Jenny. "You haven't been in the street yet, and how do you expect to go tomorrow night? Mother wouldn't let you if she were here." "Well, thank fortune she and Father both are in Southbridge. And besides that, I'm a great deal better, so hand me my dress." Jenny complied, and reclining on pillows scarcely whiter than herself, Rose Lincoln examined and found fault with a thin gossamer fabric, none suited for anyone to wear in a cold wintry night, and much less for her. "There, I knew it wasn't as wide as Ida's, into 1/8 of an inch," said she, measuring with her finger the expensive lace. "I'll have some new. Come, Jenny, suppose you go down street and get it, for I'm bent upon going." And the thoughtless girl sprang lightly upon the floor and chasséed half away across the room to show how well and strong she was. Jenny knew that further expostulation from her was useless, but she refused to go for the lace, and Sarah, the servant girl, was sent with a note from Rose saying she wanted a nice article, $8 or $10 per yard. "I don't believe Father would like to have you make such a bill," said Jenny when Sarah was gone. "Mother didn't dare tell him about your new dress, for he told her she mustn't get anything charged. And he said, too, something about hard times. Perhaps he's going to fail. Wouldn't it be dreadful?" If Rose heard the last part of this sentence, she did not need it, for to her the idea of her father's failing was preposterous. When the dinner bell rang, she threw on a heavy shawl, and descending to the dining parlor, remained below stairs all the afternoon, forcing back her cough and chatting merrily with a group of young girls who had called to see her and congratulated her upon her improved health, for excitement lent a deep glow to her cheek, which would easily deceive the inexperienced. The next day, owing to overexertion, Rose's temples were throbbing with pain, and more than once she half determined not to go. But her passion for society was strong, and Mrs. Russell's party had so long been anticipated and talked about that she felt she would not miss it for the world, and as she had confessed to Jenny, there was also a mean curiosity to see how Mary Howard would appear at a fashionable party. "Saturate my handkerchief with cologne, and put the vinaigrette where I can reach it while you arrange my hair," said she to Sarah, who at the usual hour came up to dress her young mistress for the evening. "There, be careful and not brush so hard, for that ugly pain isn't quite gone. Now bring me the glass and let me see if I do look like a ghost." "Pale, delicate folks is always more interesting than red, hearty ones," said the flattering servant as she obeyed. "Mercy, how white I am!" exclaimed Rose, glancing at the ashen face reflected by the mirror. "Rub my cheeks with cologne, Sarah, and see if that won't bring some color into them. There, that'll do. Now hand me my dress. Oh, isn't it beautiful?" she continued as she threw aside the thickly wadded double gown and assumed a light, thin dress which fell in soft, fleecy folds around her slight figure. "Faith, and you look sweet. God bless you," said Sarah as she clasped the diamond bracelet around the snowy arms and fastened the costly ornaments in the delicate ears. When her toilet was completed, Rose stood up before the long mirror, and a glow of pride came to her cheeks as she saw how lovely she really was. "You's enough sight handsomer than Miss Jenny," whispered Sarah, as the door opened and Jenny appeared, more simply arrayed than her sister, but looking as fresh and blooming as a rosebud. "How beautiful you are, Rosa," said she, "only it makes me shiver to look at your neck and arms. You'll wear your woolen sack besides your shawl and cloak, won't you?" "Nonsense! I'm not going to be bundled up this way, for don't you see it musses the lace?" said Rose, refusing the warm sack which Jenny brought her. A rap at the door and a call from Henry that the carriage was waiting ended the conversation, and throwing on their cloaks and hoods, the girls descended to the hall, where with unusual tenderness Henry caught up his invalid sister, and drawing her veil closely over her face, carried her to the covered sleigh so that her feet might not touch the icy walk. "What, Rose Lincoln here?" exclaimed half a dozen voices as Rose bounded into the dressing room. "Yes, Rose Lincoln is here," she replied, gaily divesting herself of her wrapping. "I'm not going to die just yet, I guess. Neither am I going to be housed up all winter. The fresh air has done me good already. See?" And she pointed to a bright round spot which burnt upon her cheeks. A young girl, whose family had one by one fallen victims to the great New England plague, consumption, shuddered and turned away, for to her eye the glow which Rose called health was but the hectic bloom of death. "How beautiful she is," said more than one, as with her accustomed grace Rose entered the brilliant drawing room. And truly Rose was beautiful that night, but like the gorgeous foliage of the fading autumn, 'twas the beauty of decay, for death was written on her blue-veined brow, and lurked amid the roses on her cheek. But little thought she of that, as with smiling lip and beaming eye she received the homage of the admiring throng. "Upon my word, you do look very well," said Henry, coming for a moment to his sister's side. "Why, you'd be the star of the evening, were it not for Ma Ella. See, there she comes," and he pointed to a group just entering the room. An expression of contempt curled Rose's lip as she glanced at Ella, and thought of being outshone by her dollish figure and face. "I'm in no danger unless a more formidable rival than that silly thing appears," thought she, and she drew up her slender form with a more queenly grace, and bowed somewhat haughtily to Ella, who came up to greet her. There was a world of affection in Ella's soft hazel eyes as they looked eagerly up to Henry, who, for the sake of torturing the young girl, feigned not to see her until she had stood near him some minutes. Then, offering her his hand, he said, with the utmost nonchalance, "Why, Ella, are you here? I was watching so anxiously for your sister that I did not notice your entrance." Ella had dressed herself for the party with more than usual care, and as she smoothed down the folds of her delicate pink silk and shook back her long glossy curls, she thought, "He cannot think Mary handsomer than I am tonight." And now, when the first remark he addressed to her was concerning her sister, she replied rather pettishly, "I believe you are always thinking about Mary." "Now, don't be jealous," returned Henry. "I only wish to see the contrast between you." Ella fancied that the preference would of course be in her favor, and casting aside all unpleasant feelings, she exerted herself to the utmost to keep Henry at her side, asking him numberless questions, and suddenly recollecting something which she wished to tell him if he made a movement towards leaving her. "Confound it, how tight she sticks to a fellow," thought he, "but I'll get away from her yet." Just then Ida and Mary were announced. Both Aunt Martha and Ida had taken great pains to have their young friend becomingly dressed, and she looked unusually well in the embroidered muslin skirt, satin waist, and blonde Bertha which Aunt Martha had insisted upon her accepting as a present. The rich silken braids of her luxuriant hair were confined at the back of her finely formed head with a golden arrow, which, with the exception of a plain band of gold on each wrist, was the only ornament she wore. This was her first introduction to the gay world, but so keen was her perception of what was polite and proper that none would ever have suspected it, and yet there was about her something so fresh and unstudied that she had hardly entered the room ere many were struck with her easy, unaffected manners, so different from the practised airs of the city belles. Ella watched her narrowly, whispering aside to Henry how sorry she felt for poor Mary, she was so verdant, and really hoping she wouldn't do anything very awkward, for 'twould mortify her to death. "But look," she added, "and see how many people Ida is introducing her to." "Of course, why shouldn't she?" asked Henry. And Ella replied, "I don't know. It seems so funny to see Mary here, don't it?" Before Henry could answer, a young man of his acquaintance touched his shoulder, saying, "Lincoln, who is that splendid-looking girl with Miss Selden? I haven't seen a finer face in Boston for many a day." "That? Oh, that's Miss Howard from Chicopee, an intimate friend of our family. Allow me the pleasure of introducing you." And Henry walked away, leaving Ella to the tender mercies of Rose, who, as one after another quitted her side and went over to the enemy, grew very angry, wondering if folks were bewitched, and hoping Ida Selden felt better now that she'd made so many notice her protégé. Later in the evening, William Bender came, and immediately Jenny began to talk to him of Mary and the impression she was making. Placing her hand familiarly upon his arm, as though that were its natural resting place, she led him towards a group of which Mary seemed the center of attention. Near her stood Henry Lincoln, bending so low as to threaten serious injury to his fashionable pants, and redoubling his flattering compliments in proportion as Mary grew colder and more reserved in her manner towards him. Silly and conceited as he was, he could not help noticing how differently she received William Bender from what she had himself. But all in good time, thought he, glancing at Ella to see how she was affected by his desertion of her and his flirtation with her sister. She was standing a little apart from anyone, and with her elbow resting upon a marble stand, her cheeks flushed, and her eyelashes moist with the tears she dared not shed, she was watching him with feelings in which more of real pain than jealousy was mingled. For Ella was weak and simple-hearted, and loved Henry Lincoln far better than such as he deserved to be loved. "Of what are you thinking, Ella?" asked Rose, who, finding herself nearly alone, felt willing to converse with almost anyone. At the sound of her voice, Ella looked up, and coming quickly to her side, said, "It's so dull and lonesome here. I wish I'd stayed at home." In her heart, Rose wished so too, but she was too proud to acknowledge it, and feeling unusually kind towards Ella, whose uneasiness she readily understood, she replied, "Oh, I see you are jealous of Henry, but he's only trying to tease you, for he can't be interested in that awkward thing." "But he is. I most know he is," returned Ella, with a trembling of the voice she tried in vain to subdue. And then, fearing she could not longer restrain her emotion, she suddenly broke away from Rose and ran hastily up to the dressing-room. Nothing of all this escaped Henry's quick eye, and as sundry unpaid bills for wine, brandy, oyster suppers, and livery came looming up before his mind, he thought proper to make some amends for his neglect. Accordingly, when Ella returned to the drawing-room, he offered her his arm, asking, "What made her eyes so red?" and slyly pressing her hand when she averted her face, saying, "Nothing, they weren't red." Meantime, William Bender, having managed to drop Jenny from his arm, had asked Mary to accompany him to a small conservatory which was separated from the reception rooms by a long and brilliantly lighted gallery. As they stood together admiring a rare exotic, William's manner suddenly changed, and drawing Mary closer to his side, he said distinctly, though hurriedly, "I notice, Mary, that you seem embarrassed in my presence, and I have, therefore, sought this opportunity to assure you that I shall not again distress you by a declaration of love, which, if returned, would now give me more pain than pleasure, for as I told you at Mr. Selden's, I am changed in more respects than one. It cost me a bitter struggle to give you up, but reason and judgment finally conquered, and now I can calmly think of you as sometime belonging to another, and with all of a brother's confidence can tell you that I, too, love another. Not as once I loved you, for that would be impossible, but with a calmer, more rational love." All this time Mary had not spoken, though the hand which William had taken in his trembled like an imprisoned bird. But when he came to speak of loving another, she involuntarily raised his hand to her lips, exclaiming, "It's Jenny, it's Jenny." "You have guessed rightly," returned William, smiling at the earnestness of her manner. "It is Jenny, though how such a state of things ever came about is more than I can tell." Mary thought of the old saying, "Love begets love," but she said nothing, for just then Jenny herself joined them. Looking first at William, then at Mary, and finally passing her arm around the latter, she whispered, "I know he's told you, and I'm glad, for somehow I couldn't tell you myself." Wisely thinking that his company could be dispensed with, William walked away, leaving the two girls alone. In her usual frank way, Jenny rattled on, telling Mary how happy she was and how funny it seemed to be engaged, and how frightened she was when William asked her to marry him. Fearing that they might be missed, they at last returned to the parlor, where they found Ella seated at the piano and playing a very spirited polka. Henry, who boasted that he could wind her around his little finger, had succeeded in coaxing her into good humor, but not at all desiring her company for the rest of the evening, he asked her to play, as the easiest way to be rid of her. She played unusually well, but when, at the close of the piece, she looked around for commendation from the one for whose ear alone she had played, she saw him across the room, so wholly engrossed with her sister that he probably did not even know when the sound of the piano ceased. Poor Ella! It was with the saddest heartache she had ever known that she returned from a party which had promised her so much pleasure, and which had given her so much pain. Rose, too, was bitterly disappointed. One by one her old admirers had left her for the society of the pauper, as she secretly styled Mary, and more than once during the evening had she heard the beauty and grace of her rival extolled by those for whose opinion she cared the most. And when, at 1 o'clock in the morning, she threw herself exhausted upon the sofa, she declared 'twas the last party she'd ever attend. Alas, for thee, Rosa, that declaration proved too true. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of the English Orphans, or A Home in the New World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Laura Luchsinger. The English Orphans, or A Home in the New World, by Mary Jane Holmes. Chapter 26, Making Up His Mind. For more than an hour there had been unbroken silence in the dingy old law office of Mr. Worthington, where Henry Lincoln and William Bender still remained, the one as a practicing lawyer and junior partner of the firm, and the other as a student still, for he had not yet dared to offer himself for examination. Study was something which Henry particularly disliked, and as his mother had trained him with the idea that labor for him was wholly unnecessary, he had never bestowed a thought on the future, or made an exertion of any kind. Now, however, a different phase of affairs was appearing. His father's fortune was threatened with ruin, and as, on a morning several weeks subsequent to Mrs. Russell's party, he sat in the office with his heels upon the window-sill and his arms folded over his head, he debated the all-important question whether it were better to marry Ella Campbell for the money which would save him from poverty, or to rouse himself to action for the sake of Mary Howard, whom he really fancied he loved. Frequently since the party had he met her, each time becoming more and more convinced of her superiority over the other young ladies of his acquaintance. He was undoubtedly greatly assisted in this decision by the manner with which she was received by the fashionables of Boston. But aside from that, as far as he was capable of doing so, he liked her, and was now making up his mind whether to tell her so or not. At last, breaking the silence, he exclaimed, "Hang me if I don't believe she's bewitched me, or else I'm in love. Bender, how does a chap feel when he's in love?" "Very foolish, judging from yourself," returned William, and Henry replied, "I hope you mean nothing personal, for I'm bound to avenge my honor, and 'twould be a deuced scrape for you and me to fight about your sister, as you call her, for 'tis she who inspired me or made a fool of me, one or the other." "You've changed your mind, haven't you?" asked William, a little sarcastically. "Hanged if I have," said Henry. "I was interested in her years ago, when she was the ugliest little vixen a man ever looked upon, and that's why I teased her so. I don't believe she's handsome now, but she's something, and that something has raised the mischief with me. Come, Bender, you are better acquainted with her than I am, so tell me honestly if you think I'd better marry her." The expression of William's face was a sufficient answer, and with something of his old insolence, Henry continued, "You needn't feel jealous, for I tell you Mary Howard looks higher than you. Why, she'd wear the crown of England as a matter of course any day." With a haughty frown, William replied, "You have my permission, sir, to propose as soon as you please. I rather wish you would." Then taking his hat, he left the office, while Henry continued his soliloquy as follows. "I wonder what the old folks would say to a penniless bride. Wouldn't Mother and Rose raise a row? I'd soon quiet the old woman, though, by threatening to tell that she was once a factory girl. Yes, a factory girl. But if Dad smashes up, I'll have to work, for I haven't brains enough to earn my living by my wit. I guess, on the whole, I'll go and call on Ella. She's handsome, and besides that, has the rhino, too. But, Lord, how shallow!" And the young man broke the blade of his knife as he struck it into the hardwood table by way of emphasizing his last words. Ella chanced to be out, and as Henry was returning, he overtook Ida Selden and Mary Howard, who were taking their accustomed walk. Since her conversation with William, a weight seemed lifted from Mary's spirits, and she now was happier far than she ever remembered of having been before. She was a general favorite in Boston, where all of her acquaintances vied with each other in making her stay among them as agreeable as possible. Her facilities for improvement, too, were great, and what was better than all the rest, George Morland was to return much sooner than he at first intended. While she was so happy herself, Mary could not find it in her heart to be uncourteous to Henry, and her manner towards him that morning was so kind and affable that it completely upset him. And when he parted with her at Mr. Selden's gate, his mind was quite made up to offer his heart and hand. "I shall have to work," thought he, as he entered his room to decide upon the best means by which to make his intentions known. "I shall have to work, I know, but for her sake I'd do anything." There was a bottle of Madeira standing upon the table, and as he announced his determination of doing anything for the sake of Mary Howard, his eye fell upon his favorite beverage. A deep blush mounted to his brow, and a fierce struggle between his love for Mary and his love for the wine-cup ensued. The former conquered, and seizing the bottle, he hurled it against the marble fire-jamb, exclaiming, "I'll be a man, a sober man, and never shall the light of Mary's eyes grow dim with tears wept for a drunken husband." Henry was growing eloquent, and lest the inspiration should leave him, he sat down and wrote to Mary on paper what he could not tell her face to face. Had there been a lingering doubt of her acceptance, he would undoubtedly have wasted at least a dozen sheets of the tiny gilt-edged paper, but as it was, one would suffice, for she would not scrutinize his handwriting. She would not count the blots or mark the omission of punctuating pauses. She would almost say yes before she read it. So the letter, which contained a sincere apology for his uncivil treatment of her in former years, and an ardent declaration of love for her now was written, sealed, and directed, and then there was a gentle rap upon the door. Jenny wished to come in for a book which was lying upon the table. Henry had resolved to keep his family ignorant of his intentions, but at the sight of Jenny he changed his mind. Jenny loved Mary too. Jenny would be delighted at the prospect of having her for a sister, and would help him brave the storm of his mother's displeasure. "Jenny," said he, grasping at her dress as she passed him on her way from the room. "Jenny, sit down here. I want to tell you something." Jenny glanced at the fragments of the wine bottle, then at her brother's flushed face, and instantly conjecturing that he had been drinking, said reproachfully as she laid her soft white hand on his brow, "Oh, brother, brother!" He understood her meaning, and drawing her so closely to him that his warm breath floated over her cheek, replied, "I'm not drunk, for see, there is no scent of alcohol in my breath, for I have sworn to reform, sworn that no drop of ardent spirits shall ever again pass my lips." The sudden exclamation of joy, the arms thrown so affectionately around his neck, the hot tears upon his cheek, and the kisses that warm-hearted sister imprinted upon his lips should have helped him to ratify that vow. But not for her sake had it been made, and shaking her off, he said, "Don't make a fool of yourself, Jenny. I wasn't in any danger of disgracing you, for I was only a moderate drinker. But really, I do want to talk with you on a very important subject. I want to ask who of all your acquaintances you would prefer to have for a sister, for I am going to be married." "To Ella?" asked Jenny, and Henry replied scornfully, "No, ma'am. My wife must have a soul, a heart, and a mind, to make up for my deficiency on those points. To be plain, how would you like to have me marry Mary Howard?" "Not at all, not at all," was Jenny's quick reply, while her brother said angrily, "And why not? Are you, too, proud as Lucifer like the rest of us? I could tell you something, miss, that would bring your pride down a peg or two. But answer me, why are you unwilling for me to marry Mary?" Jenny's spirit was roused too, and looking her brother fully in his face, she unhesitatingly replied, "You are not worthy of her, neither would she have you." "And this from my own sister?" said Henry, hardly able to control his wrath. "Leave the room, instantly. But stay," he added, "and let me hear the reasons for what you have asserted." "You know as well as I," answered Jenny, "that one as pure and gentle as Mary Howard should never be associated with you, who would trample upon a woman's better nature and feelings for the sake of gratifying your own wishes. Whenever it suits your purpose, you flatter and caress Ella Campbell, to whom your slightest wish is a law, and then when your mood changes, you treat her with neglect. And think you that knowing all this, Mary Howard would look favorably upon you, even if there were no stronger reason why she should refuse you?" "If you mean the brandy bottle," said Henry, growing more and more excited, "have I not sworn to quit it? And is it for you to goad me on to madness until I break that vow?" "Forgive me if I have been too harsh," said Jenny, taking Henry's hand. "You are my brother, and Mary my dearest friend, and when I say I would not see her wedded to you, 'tis not because I love you less, but her the more. You are wholly unlike, and would not be happy together. But oh, if her love would win you back to virtue, I would almost beg her on my bended knees not to turn away from you." "And I tell you her love can win me back, when nothing else in the kingdom will," said Henry, snatching up the note and hurrying away. For a time after he left the room, Jenny sat in a kind of stupefied maze. That Mary would refuse her brother she was certain, and she trembled for the effect that refusal would produce upon him. Other thoughts, too, crowded upon the young girl's mind, and made her tears flow fast. Henry had hinted of something which he could tell her if he would, and her heart too well foreboded what that something was. The heavy sound of her father's footsteps, which sometimes kept her awake the livelong night, his pale, haggard face in the morning, and her mother's nervous, anxious manner told her that ruin was hanging over them. In the midst of her reverie, Henry returned. He had delivered the letter, and now, restless and unquiet, he sat down to await its answer. It came at last, his rejection, yet couched in language so kind and conciliatory that he could not feel angry. Twice, 3 times he read it over, hoping to find some intimation that possibly she might relent. But no, it was firm and decided. And while she thanked him for the honor he conferred upon her, she respectfully declined accepting it, assuring him that his secret should be kept inviolate. "There's some comfort in that," thought he, "for I wouldn't like to have it known that I had been refused by a poor, unknown girl." And then, as the conviction came over him that she would never be his, he laid his head upon the table and wept such tears as a spoiled child might weep when refused a toy, too costly and delicate to be trusted in its rude grasp. Ere long there was another knock at the door, and, hastily wiping away all traces of his emotion, Henry admitted his father, who had come to talk of their future prospects, which were even worse than he had feared. But he did not reproach his wayward son, nor hint that his reckless extravagance had hastened the calamity which otherwise might possibly have been avoided. Calmly he stated the extent to which they were involved, adding that though an entire failure might be prevented a short time, it would come at last, and that an honorable payment of his debts would leave them beggars. "For myself, I do not care," said the wretched man, pressing hard his aching temples, where the gray hairs had thickened within a few short weeks. "For myself, I do not care, but for my wife and children, for Rose, and that she must miss her accustomed comforts, is the keenest pang of all." All this time Henry had not spoken, but thought was busily at work. He could not bestir himself. He had no energy for that now. But he could marry Ella Campbell, whose wealth would keep him in the position he now occupied, besides supplying many of Rose's wants. Cursing the fate which had reduced him to such an extremity, towards the dusk of evening Henry started again for Mrs. Campbell's. Lights were burning in the parlor, and as the curtains were drawn back he could see through the partially opened shutter that Ella was alone. Reclining in a large sofa-chair, she sat, leaning upon her elbow, the soft curls of her brown hair falling over her white arm, which the full blue cashmere sleeve exposed to view. She seemed deeply engaged in thought, and never before had she looked so lovely to Henry, who, as he gazed upon her, felt a glow of pride in thinking that fair young girl could be his for the asking. "I wish she was not so confounded flat," thought he, hastily ringing the doorbell. Instantly divining who it was, Ella sprang up, and when Henry entered the parlor, he found her standing in the center of the room, where the full blaze of the chandelier fell upon her childish features, lighting them up with radiant beauty. "And so my little pet is alone," said he, coming forward, and raising to his lips the dainty fingers which Ella extended towards him. "I hope the old auntie is out," he continued, "for I want to see you on special business." Ella noticed how excited he appeared, and always on the alert for something when he was with her, she began to tremble, and without knowing what she said, asked him what he wanted of her. "Zounds," thought Henry, "she meets me more than halfway." And then, lest his resolution should fail, he reseated her in the chair she had left, and drawing an ottoman to her side, hastily told her of his love, ending his declaration by saying that from the first time he ever saw her he had determined that she should be his wife. And Ella, wholly deceived, allowed her head to droop upon his shoulder while she whispered to him her answer. Thus they were betrothed, Henry Lincoln and Ella Campbell. "Glad am I to be out of that atmosphere," thought the newly engaged young man, as he reached the open air and began to breathe more freely. "Goodness me, won't I lead a glorious life, with that jar of tomato sweetmeats. Now if she'd only hung back a little. But no, she said yes before I fairly got the words out, but money covereth a multitude of sins. I beg your pardon, ma'am," said he quickly, as he became conscious of having rudely jostled a young lady who was turning the corner. Looking up, he met Mary Howard's large, dark eyes fixed rather inquiringly upon him. She was accompanied by one of Mr. Selden's servants, and he felt sure she was going to visit her sister. Of course, Ella would tell her all, and what must Mary think of one who could so soon repeat his vows of love to another? In all the world there was not an individual for whose good opinion Henry Lincoln cared one half so much as for Mary Howard's, and the thought that he should now surely lose it maddened him. The resolution of the morning was forgotten, and that night a fond father watched and wept over his inebriate son, for never before had Henry Lincoln been so beastly intoxicated. End of chapter 26.
Chapter number 27 of the English Orphans, or A Home in the New World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by April 6090. The English Orphans, or A Home in the New World, by Mary Jane Holmes. Shadows Deepen. From one of the luxuriously furnished chambers of her father's elegant mansion, Jenny Lincoln looked mournfully out upon the thick angry clouds, which the livelong day had obscured the winter sky. Dreamily for a while she listened to the patter of rain as it fell upon the deserted pavement below, and then, with a long deep sigh, she turned away and wept. Poor Jenny! The day was rainy and dark and dreary, but darker far were the shadows stealing over her pathway. Turn which way she would, there was not one ray of sunshine which even her buoyant spirits could gather from the surrounding gloom. Her only sister was slowly but surely dying, and when Jenny thought of this, she felt that if Rose could only live, she'd try and bear the rest, try to forget how much she loved William Bender, who that morning had honorably and manfully asked her of her parents, and been spurned with contempt, not by her father, for could he have followed the dictates of his better judgment, he would willingly have given his daughter to the care of one who he knew would carefully shield her from the storms of life. It was not he, but the cold, proud mother, who so haughtily refused William's request, accusing him of taking underhanded means to win her daughter's affections. "I'd rather see you dead," said the stony-hearted woman, when Jenny knelt at her feet and pleaded for her to take back the words she had spoken. "I had rather see you dead than married to such as he. I mean what I have said, and you will never be his." Jenny knew William too well to think he would ever sanction an act of disobedience to her mother, and her heart grew faint and her eyes dim with tears, as she thought of conquering the love which had grown with her growth, and strengthened with her strength. There was another reason, too, why Jenny should weep as she sat there alone in her room. From her father she had heard of all that was to happen. The luxuries to which all her life she had been accustomed were to be hers no longer. The pleasant country house in Chicopee, dearer far than her city home, must be sold, and nowhere in the wide world was there a place for them to rest. It was of all this that Jenny was thinking that dreary afternoon, and when at last she turned away from the window, her thoughts went back again to her sister, and she murmured, "If she could only live!" But it could not be. The fiat had gone forth, and Rose, like the fair summer flower whose name she bore, must fade and pass away. For several days after Mrs. Russell's party, she tried to keep up, but the laws of nature had been outraged, and now she lay all day in a darkened room, moaning with pain and wondering why the faces of those around her were so sad and mournful. "Jenny," said she one day when the physician, as usual, had left the room without a word of encouragement, "Jenny, what does make you look so blue and forlorn? I hope you don't fancy I'm going to die." "Of course I'm not." Here a coughing fit ensued, and after it was over she continued, "Isn't George Morland expected soon?" Jenny nodded, and Rose proceeded, I must and will be well before he comes, for 'twill never do to yield the field to that Howard girl, who they say is contriving every way to get him, coaxing round old Aunt Martha, and all that. But how ridiculous! George Morland with his fastidious taste marry a pauper? And the sick girl's fading cheeks glowed, and her eyes grew brighter at the absurd idea. Just then Mr. Lincoln entered the room. He had been consulting with his wife the propriety of taking Rose to her grandmother's in the country. She would thus be saved the knowledge of his failure, which could not much longer be kept a secret, and besides that, they all, sooner or later, must leave the house in which they were living, and he judged it best to remove his daughter while she was able to endure the journey. At first Mrs. Lincoln wept bitterly, for if Rose went to Glenwood, she too must of course go, and the old brown house, with its oaken floor and wainscoted ceiling, had now no charms for the gay woman of fashion, who turned with disdain from the humble roof which had sheltered her childhood. Lifting her tearful eyes to her husband's face, she said, "Oh, I can't go there. Why not engage rooms at the hotel in Glenwood village? Mother's so odd and peculiar in her ways of living that I never can endure it." And again Mrs. Lincoln buried her face in the folds of her fine linen cambric, thinking there was never in the world a woman as wretched as herself. "Don't, Hattie, don't! It distresses me to see you feel thus. Rooms and board at the hotel would cost far more than I can afford to pay. And then, too," here he paused as if to gather courage for what he was next to say, "and then, too, your mother will care for Rose's soul as well as body." Mrs. Lincoln looked up quickly, and her husband continued, "Yes, Hattie, we need not deceive ourselves longer. Rose must die, and you know as well as I whether our training has been such as will best fit her for another world." For a time Mrs. Lincoln was silent, and then in a more subdued tone she said, "Do as you like, only you must tell Rose. I never can." Half an hour later Mr. Lincoln had entered his daughter's room, and bending affectionately over her pillow, said, "How is my darling to-day?" "Better, almost well," returned Rose, raising herself in bed to prove what she had said. "I shall be out in a few days, and then you'll buy me one of those elegant plaid silks, won't you? All the girls are wearing them, and I haven't had a new dress this winter, and here 'tis almost March." Oh, how the father longed to tell his dying child that her next dress would be a shroud, but he could not. He was too much of a man of the world to speak to her of death. He would leave that for her grandmother. So without answering her question, he said, "Rose, do you think you are able to be moved into the country?" "What, to Chicopee? That horrid dull place? I thought we were not going there this summer." "No, not to Chicopee, but to your Grandma Howland's in Glenwood. The physician thinks you will be more quiet there, and the pure air will do you good." Rose looked earnestly in her father's face to see if he meant what he said, and then replied, "I'd rather go anywhere in the world than to Glenwood. You've no idea how I hate to stay there. Grandma is so queer, and the things in the house so fussy and countrified, and cooks by a fireplace, and washes in a tin basin, and wipes on a crash towel that hangs on a roller." Mr. Lincoln could hardly repress a smile at Rose's reasoning, but perceiving that he must be decided, he said, "We think it best for you to go, and shall accordingly make arrangements to take you in the course of a week or two. Your mother will stay with you, and Jenny, too, will be there a part of the time." Then, not wishing to witness the effect of his words, he hastily left the room, pausing in the hall to wipe away the tears which involuntarily came to his eyes, as he overheard Rose angrily wonder, "Why should she be turned out of doors when she wasn't able to sit up? I never can bear the scent of those great tallow candles, never," said she. "And then to think of the coarse sheets and patchwork bed-quilts. Oh, it's dreadful." Jenny's heart, too, was well nigh bursting, but she forced down her own sorrow while she strove to comfort her sister, telling her how strong and well the bracing air of the country would make her, and how refreshing when her fever was on would be the clear, cold water which gushed from the spring near the thorn-apple tree, where in childhood they so oft had played. Then she spoke of the miniature waterfall, which not far from their grandmother's door made fairy-like music all the day long, and at last, as if soothed by the sound of that far-off falling water, Rose forgot her trouble and sank into a sweet, refreshing slumber, in which she dreamed that the joyous summer-time had come, and that she, well and strong, as Jenny had predicted, was the happy bride of George Morland, who led her to a grass-grown grave, the grave of Mary Howard, who had died of consumption and been buried in Glenwood. While Rose was sleeping, Jenny stole softly down the stairs, and throwing on her shawl and bonnet, went across the street to confide her troubles with Mary Howard, who, while she sympathized deeply with her young friend, was not surprised from her slight acquaintance with Mrs. Lincoln, she could readily believe that one so ambitious and haughty would seek for her daughter a wealthier alliance than a poor lawyer. All that she could say to comfort Jenny she did, bidding her to wait patiently and hope for the best. "You are blue and dispirited," said she, "and a little fresh air will do you good. Suppose we walk round a square or two, for, see, the rain is over now." Jenny consented, and they had hardly gone half the length of a street when William himself joined them. Rightly guessing that her absence would not be noticed, Mary turned suddenly into a side street, leaving William and Jenny to themselves. From that walk Jenny returned to her home much happier than she left it. She had seen William, had talked with him of the past, present, and future, had caught from his hopeful spirit the belief that all would be well in time, and in a far more cheerful frame of mind she re-entered her sister's room. And when Rose, who was awake, and noticed the change in her appearance, asked what had happened, she could not forbear telling her. Rose heard her through, and then very kindly informed her that she was a fool to care for such a rough scuff. In a few days preparations were commenced for moving Rose to Glenwood, and in the excitement of getting ready she in a measure forgot the tallow candles and patchwork bedquilt, the thoughts of which had so much shocked her at first. "Put in my embroidered merino morning gown," said she to Jenny, who was packing her trunk, "and the blue cashmere one faced with white satin. And don't forget my best cambric skirt, the one with so much work on it, for when George Morland comes to Glenwood I shall want to look as well as possible. And then, too, I like to see the country folks open their mouths and stare at city fashions." "What makes you think George will come to Glenwood?" asked Jenny, as she packed away dresses her sister would never wear. "I know, and that's enough," answered Rose. "And now, before you forget it, put in my leghorn flat, for if I stay long I shall want it. And see how nicely you can fold the dress I wore at Mrs. Russell's party." "Why, Rose, what can you possibly want of that?" asked Jenny, and Rose replied, "Oh, I want to show it to Grandma, just to hear her groan over our extravagance, and predict that will yet come to ruin." Jenny thought that if Rose could have seen her father that morning, when the bill for the dress and its costly trimmings was presented, she would have wished it removed for ever from her sight. Early in the winter, Mr. Lincoln had seen that all such matters were settled, and of this bill, more recently made, he knew nothing. "I can't pay it now," said he promptly to the boy who brought it. "Tell Mr. Holton I will see him in a day or two." The boy took the paper with an insolent grin, for he had heard the fast-circulating rumor that one of the big bugs was about to smash up, and now, eager to confirm the report, he ran swiftly back to his employer, who muttered, "Just as I expected. I'll draw on him for what I lent him, and that'll tell the story. My daughters can't afford to wear such things, and I'm not going to furnish money for his." Of all this Rose did not dream, for in her estimation there was no end to her father's wealth, and the possibility of his failing had never entered her mind. Henry indeed had once hinted it to her, on the occasion of her asking him how he could fancy Ella Campbell enough to marry her. "I'm not marrying her, but her money," was his prompt answer, "and I assure you, young lady, we are more in need of that article than you imagine." Rose paid no attention to this speech, and when she found that her favorite Sarah was not to accompany her, she almost wept herself into convulsions, declaring that her father, to whom the mother imputed the blame, was cruel and hard-hearted, and that if it was Jenny instead of herself who was sick, she guessed she'd have 40 waiting maids if she wanted them. "I should like to know who she is to take care of me," said she. "Jenny isn't going, and Grandma would think it an unpardonable extravagance to hire a servant. I will not go, and that ends it. If you want to be rid of me, I can die fast enough here." Mrs. Lincoln had nothing to say, for she well knew she had trained her daughter to despise everything pertaining to the old brown house, once her childhood home, and where even now the kind-hearted grandmother was busy in preparing for the reception of the invalid. From morning until night did the little active form of Grandma Howland flit from room to room, washing windows which needed no washing, dusting tables on which no dust was lying, and doing 1,000 things which she thought would add to the comfort of Rose. On one room in particular did the good old lady bestow more than usual care. 'Twas the spare chamber, at whose windows Rose, when a little girl, had stood for hours, watching the thin blue mist and fleecy clouds as they floated around the tall green mountains, which at no great distance seemed to tower upward and upward, until their tops were lost in the sky above. At the foot of the mountain, and near Glenwood, was a small sheet of water, which now, in the springtime, was plainly discernible from the windows of Rose's chamber, and with careful forethought Mrs. Howland arranged the bed so that the sick girl could look out upon the tiny lake and the mountains beyond. Snowy white and fragrant with the leaves of rose and geranium, which had been pressed within their folds, were the sheets which covered the bed, the last Rose Lincoln would ever rest upon. Soft and downy were the pillows, and the patchwork quilt. Rose's particular aversion was removed, and its place supplied by one of more modern make. Once Mrs. Howland thought to shade the windows with the Venetian blinds, which hung in the parlor below, but they shut out so much sunlight, and made the room so gloomy, that she carried them back, substituting in their place plain white muslin curtains. The best rocking chair and the old-fashioned carved mirror were brought up from the parlor, and then when all was done, Mrs. Howland gave a sigh of satisfaction that it was so well done, and closed the room until Rose should arrive. End of chapter 27. Read by April 6090.
Chapter 28 of the English Orphans, or A Home in the New World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Laura Luchsinger. Chapter 28. Glenwood. Through the rich crimson curtains which shaded Rose Lincoln's sleeping room, the golden beams of a warm March sun were stealing, lighting up the thin features of the sick girl with a glow so nearly resembling health that Jenny, when she came to wish her sister good morning, started with surprise at seeing her look so well. "Why, Rose, you are better," said she, kissing the fair cheek on which the ray of sunlight was resting. Rose had just awoke from her deep morning slumber, and now, remembering that this was the day appointed for her dreaded journey to Glenwood, she burst into tears, wondering why they would persist in dragging her from home. "It's only a pretense to get me away, I know," said she, "and you may as well confess it at once. You are tired of waiting upon me." Mr. Lincoln now came in to see his daughter, but all his attempts to soothe her were in vain. She only replied, "Let me stay at home, here in this room, my own room," adding more in anger than sorrow, "I'll try to die as soon as I can, and be out of the way if that's what you want." "Oh, Rose, Rose, poor father don't deserve that," said Jenny, raising her hand as if to stay her sister's thoughtless words, while Mr. Lincoln, laying his face upon the pillow so that his silvered locks mingled with the dark tresses of his child, wept bitterly, bitterly. And still he could not tell her why she must leave her home. He would rather bear her unjust reproaches than have her know that they were beggars, for a sudden shock, the physician said, might at any time end her life. Thoroughly selfish as she was, Rose still loved her father dearly, and when she saw him thus moved and knew that she was the cause, she repented of her hasty words, and laying her long white arm across his neck, asked forgiveness for what she had said. "I will go to Glenwood," said she, "but must I stay there long?" "Not long, not long, my child," was the father's reply, and Jenny brushed away a tear as she too thought, "Not long." And so, with the belief that her stay was to be short, Rose passively suffered them to dress her for the journey, which was to be performed partly by railway and partly in a carriage. For the first time since the night of his engagement with Ella Campbell, Henry was this morning free from intoxicating drinks. He had heard them say that Rose must die, but it had seemed to him like an unpleasant dream, from which he now awoke to find it a reality. They had brought her down from her chamber and laid her upon the sofa in the parlor, where Henry came unexpectedly upon her. He had not seen her for several days, and when he found her lying there so pale and still, her long eyelashes resting heavily upon her colorless cheek, and her small white hands hanging listlessly by her side, he softly approached her, thinking her asleep, kissed her brow, cheek, and lips, whispering as he did so, "Poor girl, poor Rosa, so young and beautiful." Rose started, and wiping from her forehead the tear her brother had left there, she looked anxiously around. Henry was gone, but his words had awakened in her mind a new and startling idea. Was she going to die? Did they think so, and was this the reason of Henry's unwonted tenderness? And sinking back upon her pillows, she wept as only those weep to whom, in the full flush of youth and beauty, death comes a dreaded and unwelcome guest. "I cannot die. I will not die," said she at last, rousing herself with sudden energy. "I feel that within me which says I shall not die. The air of Glenwood will do me good, and Grandma's skill in nursing is wonderful." Consoled by these reflections, she became more calm, and had her father now given his consent for her to remain in Boston, she would of her own accord have gone to Glenwood. The morning train bound for Albany stood in the depot, waiting the signal to start, and just before the final "all aboard" was sounded, a handsome equipage drove slowly up, and from it alighted Mr. Lincoln, bearing in his arms his daughter, whose head rested wearily upon his shoulder. Accompanying him were his wife, Jenny, and a gray-haired man, the family physician. Together they entered the rear car, and instantly there was a hasty turning of heads, a shaking of curls, and low whispers, as each noticed and commented upon the unearthly beauty of Rose, who in her father's arms lay as if wholly exhausted with the effort she had made. The sight of her, so young, so fair, and apparently so low, hushed all selfish feelings, and a gay bridal party who had taken possession of the ladies' saloon immediately came forward, offering it to Mr. Lincoln, who readily accepted it, and laying Rose upon the long settee, he made her as comfortable as possible with the numerous pillows and cushions he had brought with him. As the creaking engine moved slowly out of Boston, Rose asked that the window might be raised, and leaning upon her elbow, she looked out upon her native city, which she was leaving forever. Some such idea came to her mind, but quickly repressing it, she turned towards her father, saying with a smile, "I shall be better when I see Boston again." Mr. Lincoln turned away to hide a tear, for he had no hope that she would ever return. Towards nightfall of the next day they reached Glenwood, and Rose, more fatigued than she was willing to acknowledge, now that she was so determined to get well, was lifted from the carriage and carried into the house. Mrs. Howland hastened forward to receive her, and for once Rose forgot to notice whether the cut of her cap was of this year's fashion or last. "I am weary," she said. "Lay me where I can rest." and with the grandmother leading the way, the father carried his child to the chamber prepared for her with so much care. "It's worse than I thought 'twas," said Mrs. Howland, returning to the parlor below where her daughter, after looking in vain for the big rocking chair, had thrown herself with a sigh upon the chintz-covered lounge. "It's a deal worse than I thought 'twas. Hasn't she catched cold or been exposed some way?" "Not in the least," returned Mrs. Lincoln, twirling the golden stopper of her smelling bottle. "The foundation of her sickness was laid at Mount Holyoke, and the whole faculty ought to be indicted for manslaughter." Jenny's clear, truthful eyes turned towards her mother, who frowned darkly and continued, "She was as well as anyone until she went there, and I consider it my duty to warn all parents against sending their daughters to a place where neither health, manners, nor anything else is attended to, except religion and housework." Jenny had not quite got over her childish habit of occasionally setting her mother right on some points, and she could not forbear saying that Dr. Klaber thought Rose injured herself by attending Mrs. Russell's party. "Dr. Klaber doesn't know any more about it than I do," returned her mother. "He's always minding other folks' business, and so are you. I guess you'd better go upstairs and see if Rose doesn't want something." Jenny obeyed, and as she entered her sister's chamber, Rose lifted her head languidly from her pillow, and pointing to a window which had been opened that she might breathe more freely, said, "Just listen. Don't you hear that horrid croaking?" Jenny laughed aloud, for she knew Rose had heard "that horrid croaking" more than 100 times in Chicopee, but in Glenwood everything must necessarily assume a goblin form in sound. Seating herself upon the foot of the bed, she said, "Why, that's the frogs. I love to hear them dearly. It makes me feel both sad and happy, just as the crickets do that sing under the hearth in our old home at Chicopee." Jenny's whole heart was in the country, and she could not so well sympathize with her nervous, sensitive sister, who shrank from country sights and country sounds. Accidentally spying some tall locust branches swinging in the evening breeze before the east window, she again spoke to Jenny, telling her to look and see if the tree leaned against the house. "For if it does," said she, "and creaks, I shan't sleep a wink tonight." After assuring her that the tree was all right, Jenny added, "I love to hear the wind howl through these old trees, and were it not for you, I should wish it might blow so that I could lie awake and hear it." When it grew darker and the stars began to come out, Jenny was told to close the shutters. "Now, Rose," said she, "you are making half of this, for you know as well as I that Grandma's house hasn't got any shutters." "Oh, mercy, no more it hasn't. What shall I do?" said Rose, half crying with vexation. "That coarse muslin stuff is worse than nothing, and everybody'll be looking in to see me." "They'll have to climb to the top of the trees then," said Jenny, "for the ground descends in every direction, and the road, too, is so far away. Besides that, who is there that wants to see you?" Rose didn't know. She was sure there was somebody, and when Mrs. Howland came up with one of the nicest little suppers on a small tea tray, how was she shocked to find the window covered with her best blankets, which were safely packed away in the closet adjoining. "Rose was afraid somebody would look in and see her," said Jenny, as she read her grandmother's astonishment in her face. "Look in and see her," repeated Mrs. Howland. "I've undressed without curtains there 40 years, and I'll be bound nobody ever peeked at me. But come," she added, "set up and see if you can't eat a mouthful or so. Here's some broiled chicken, a slice of toast, some currant jelly that I made myself, and the swimmingest cup of black tea you ever see. It'll e'ena'most bear up an egg." "Sweetened with brown sugar, ain't it?" said Rose, sipping a little of the tea. In great distress, the good old lady replied that she was out of white sugar, but some folks loved brown just as well. "Ooh, take it away," said Rose. "It makes me sick, and I don't believe I can eat another mite." But in spite of her belief, the food rapidly disappeared, while she alternately made fun of the little silver spoons, her grandmother's bridal gift, and found fault because the jelly was not put up in porcelain jars instead of the old blue earthen teacup tied over with a piece of paper. Until a late hour that night did Rose keep the whole household, her mother excepted, on the alert, doing the 1,000 useless things which her nervous fancy prompted. First, the front door, usually secured with a bit of whittled shingle, must be nailed, or somebody would break in. Next, the windows, which in the rising wind began to rattle, must be made fast with divers knives, scissors, combs, and keys. And lastly, the old clock must be stopped, for Rose was not accustomed to its striking, and it would keep her awake. "Dear me," said the tired old grandmother, when at about midnight she repaired to her own cozy little bedroom, "how fidgety she is. I should have supposed that livin' in the city so, she'd got used to noises." In a day or two, Mr. Lincoln and Jenny went back to Boston, bearing with them a long list of articles which Rose must and would have. As they were leaving the house, Mrs. Howland brought out her black leathern wallet, and forcing 2 $10 bills into Jenny's hand, whispered, "Take it to pay for them things. Your pa has need enough for his money, and this is some I've earned along, knitting and selling butter. At first I thought I would get a new chamber carpet, but the old one answers my turn very well, so take it and buy Rose everything she wants." And all this time the thankless girl upstairs was fretting and muttering about her grandmother's stinginess in not having a better carpet than the old faded thing which looked as if manufactured before the flood. End of Chapter 28.
Chapter 29 of The English Orphans, or A Home in the New World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Belinda McReynolds. The English Orphans, or A Home in the New World by Mary Jane Holmes. A New Discovery. On the same day when Rose Lincoln left Boston for Glenwood, Mrs. Campbell sat in her own room, gloomy and depressed. For several days she had not been well, and besides that, Ella's engagement with Henry Lincoln filled her heart with dark forebodings, for rumors said that he was unprincipled and dissipated, and before giving her consent, Mrs. Campbell had labored long with Ella, who insisted that he was no worse than other young men. Most of them drank occasionally, and Henry did nothing more. On this afternoon, she had again conversed with Ella, who angrily declared that she would marry him even if she knew he'd be a drunkard, adding, "But he won't be. He loves me better than all the world, and I shall help him to reform." "I don't believe your sister would marry him," continued Mrs. Campbell, who was becoming much attached to Mary. "I don't believe she would either, and for a very good reason too," returned Ella, pettishly jerking her long curls. "But I can't see why you should bring her up, for he has never been more than polite to her, and that, he assured me, was wholly on my account." "She isn't pleased with your engagement?" said Mrs. Campbell, and Ella replied, "Well, what of that? It's nothing to her, and I didn't mean she should know it. But Jenny, like a little tattler, must needs tell her, and so she has read me a 2-hours sermon on the subject. She acted so queer, too. I didn't know what to think of her. And when she and Henry are together, they look so funny, and I almost believe she wants him herself. But she can't have him. No, she can't have him." And secure in the belief that she was the first and only object of Henry's affection, Ella danced out of the room to attend to the seamstress who was doing her plain sewing. After she was gone, Mrs. Campbell fell asleep, and for the first time in many a long year, dreamed of her old home in England. She did not remember it herself, but she had so often heard it described by the aunt who adopted her, that now it came up vividly before her mind, with its dark stone walls, its spacious grounds, terraced gardens, running vines and creeping roses. Something about it, too, reminded her of what Ella had once said of her mother's early home, and when she awoke, she wondered that she had never questioned the child more concerning her parents. She was just lying back again upon her pillow when there was a gentle rap at the door, and Mary Howard's soft voice asked permission to come in. "Yes, do," said Mrs. Campbell. Perhaps you can charm away my headache, which is dreadful." "I'll try," answered Mary. "Shall I read to you?" "If you please. But first give me my salts. You'll find them there in that drawer." Mary obeyed, but started as she opened the drawer, for there, on the top, lay a small, old-fashioned miniature of a fair young child, so nearly resembling Frankie that the tears instantly came to her eyes. "What is it?" asked Mrs. Campbell, and Mary replied, "This picture, so much like brother Frankie. May I look at it?" "Certainly," said Mrs. Campbell. "That is a picture of my sister." For a long time Mary gazed at the sweet childish face, which, with its clustering curls and soft brown eyes, looked to her so much like Frankie. At last, turning to Mrs. Campbell, she said, "You must have loved her very much. What was her name?" "Ella Temple," was Mrs. Campbell's reply, and Mary instantly exclaimed, "Why, that was my mother's name." "Your mother, Mary, your mother," said Mrs. Campbell, starting up from her pillow. "But no, it cannot be. Your mother is lying in Chicopee, and Ella, my sister, died in England." Every particle of colour had left Mary's face, and her eyes, now black as midnight, stared wildly at Mrs. Campbell. The sad story which her mother had once told her came back to her mind, bringing with it the thought which had so agitated her companion. "Yes," she continued, without noticing what Mrs. Campbell had said, "my mother was Ella Temple, and she had 2 sisters, one her own and the other a half-sister, Sarah Fletcher and Jane Temple, both of whom came to America many years ago." "Tell me more. Tell me all you know," whispered Mrs. Campbell, grasping Mary's hand, "and how it came about that I thought she was dead, my sister." Upon this point Mary could throw no light, but of all that she had heard from her mother she told, and then Mrs. Campbell, pointing to her writing desk, said, "Bring it to me. I must read that letter again." Mary obeyed, and taking out a much soiled, blotted letter, Mrs. Campbell asked her to read it aloud. It was as follows: "Daughter Jane, I now take this opportunity of informing you that I have lost your sister Ella, and have now no child saving yourself, who, if you behave well, will be my only heir. Sometimes I wish you were here, for it's lonesome living alone, but I suppose you're better off where you are. Do you know anything of that girl, Sarah? Her cross-grained uncle has never written me a word since he left England. If I live 3 years longer, I shall come to America, and until that time, adieu. Your father, Henry Temple, Esquire, MP." "How short and cold!" was Mary's first exclamation, for her impressions of her grandfather were not very agreeable. "It's like all his letters," answered Mrs. Campbell. "But it was cruel to make me think Ella was dead, for how else could I suppose he had lost her? And when I asked the particulars of her death, he sent me no answer. But at this I did not so much wonder, for he never wrote oftener than once in 2 or 3 years, and the next that I heard, he was dead, and I was heiress of all his wealth." Then, as the conviction came over her that Mary was indeed the child of her own sister, she wound her arms about her neck, and kissing her lips, murmured, "My child, my Mary! Oh, had I known this sooner, you should not have been so cruelly deserted, and little Allie should never have died in the almshouse. But you'll never leave me now, for all that I have is yours and Ella's." The thought of Ella touched a new chord, and Mrs. Campbell's tears were rendered less bitter by the knowledge that she had cared for and been a mother to one of her sister's orphan children. "I know now," said she, "why from the first I felt so drawn towards Ella, and why her clear, large eyes are so much like my own lost darlings, and even you, Mary." Here Mrs. Campbell paused, for proud as she now was of Mary, there had been a time when the haughty lady turned away from the sober, homely little child who begged so piteously to go with Ella where there was room and to spare. All this came up in sad review before Mrs. Campbell, and as she recalled the incidents of her sister's death, and thought of the noble little Frank who often went hungry and cold that his mother and sisters might be warmed and fed, she felt that her heart would burst with its weight of sorrow. "Oh, my God," said she, "to die so near me, my only sister, and I never know it, never go near her. I, with all my wealth, as much hers as mine, and she dying of starvation." Wiping the hot tears from her own eyes, Mary strove to comfort her aunt by telling her how affectionately her mother had always remembered her. "And even on the night of her death," said she spoke of you, and bade me, if I ever found you, love you for her sake. "Will you? Do you love me?" asked Mrs. Campbell. Mary's warm kiss upon her cheek and the loving clasp of her arms round her aunt's neck was a sufficient answer. "Do you know aught of my Aunt Sarah?" Mary asked at last, and Mrs. Campbell replied, "Nothing definite. From father we first heard that she was in New York, and then Aunt Morris wrote to her uncle, making inquiries concerning her. I think the Fletchers were rather peculiar in their dispositions, and were probably jealous of our family, for the letter was long unanswered, and when at last Sarah's uncle wrote, he said that independent of old Temple's aid, she had received a good education, adding further that she had married and gone west, and that he was intending soon to follow her. He neither gave the name of her husband or the place to which they were going, and as all our subsequent letters were unanswered, I know not whether she is dead or alive. But often when I think how alone I am, without a relative in the world, I have prayed and wept that she might come back. For though I never knew her, never saw her that I remember, she was my mother's child, and I should love her for that." Just then Ella came singing into the room, but started when she saw how excited Mrs. Campbell appeared and how swollen her eyelids were. "Why, what's the matter?" said she. "I never saw you cry before, excepting that time when I told you I was going to marry Henry." And Ella laughed a little spiteful laugh, for she had not yet recovered from her anger at what Mrs. Campbell had said when she was in there before. "Hush, shh," said Mary softly, and Mrs. Campbell, drawing Ella to her side, told her of the strange discovery she had made. Then, beckoning Mary to approach, she laid a hand upon each of the young girls' heads, and blessing them, called them her own dear children. It would be hard telling what Ella's emotions were. One moment she was glad, and the next she was sorry, for she was so supremely selfish that the fact of Mary's being now in every respect her equal gave her more pain than pleasure. Of course, Mrs. Campbell would love her best. Everybody did who knew her, everybody but Henry. And when Mrs. Campbell asked why she did not speak, she replied, "Why, what shall I say? Shall I go into ecstasies about it? To be sure, I'm glad, very glad that you are my aunt. Will Mary live here now?" "Yes, always," answered Mrs. Campbell. And "No, never," thought Mary. Her sister's manner chilled her to the heart. She thoroughly understood her, and felt sure they could not be happy together, for Ella was to live at home even after her marriage. There was also another and stronger reason why Mary should not remain with her aunt. Mrs. Mason had the first, best claim upon her. She it was who had befriended her when a lonely, neglected orphan, taking her from the almshouse and giving her a pleasant, happy home. She it was, too, who in sickness and health had cared for her with all a mother's love, and Mary would not leave her now. So when Mrs. Campbell began to make plans for the future, each one of which had a direct reference to herself, she modestly said she would never desert Mrs. Mason, stating her reasons with so much delicacy and yet so firmly that Mrs. Campbell was compelled to acknowledge she was right, while at the same time she secretly wondered whether Ella, for her sake, would refuse a more elegant home were it offered her. All that afternoon, the contrast between the two girls grew upon her so painfully that she would almost gladly have exchanged her selfish, spoilt Ella for the once despised and neglected orphan. And when at evening Mary came to say good night, she embraced her with a fervency which seemed to say she could not give her up. Scarcely had the door closed upon Mary ere there was a violent bell ring, and Henry Lincoln was ushered into the parlour where Ella, radiant with smiles, sat awaiting him. They were invited that evening to a little sociable, and Ella had bestowed more than usual time and attention upon her toilet, for Henry was very observant of ladies' dresses, and now that he had a right, was constantly dictating as to what she should wear and what she should not. On this evening, everything seemed fated to go wrong. Ella had heard Henry say that he was partial to mazarine blue, and not suspecting that his preference arose from the fact of his having frequently seen her sister in a neatly fitting blue merino, she determined to surprise him with his favourite colour. Accordingly, when Henry entered the parlour, he found her arrayed in a rich blue silk, made low in the neck with loose full sleeves and flounced to the waist. The young man had just met Mary at the gate, and as usual after seeing her was in the worst of humours. His first salutation to Ella was, "Well, Mother Bunch, you look pretty, don't you?" "I don't know, do I?" said Ella, taking him literally. "Do you?" he repeated, with an impatient toss of his head. "All but the pretty. I advise you to take off that thing," pointing to the dress. "I never saw you look worse." Since Ella's engagement, she had cried half the time, and now, as usual, the tears came to her eyes, provoking Henry still more. "Now make your eyes red," said he. "I declare, I wonder if there's anything of you but tears." "Please don't talk so," said Ella, laying her hand on his arm. "I had this dress made on purpose to please you, for you once said you liked dark blue." "And so I do on your sister, but your complexion is different from hers, and then those ruffles and bag sleeves make you look like a little barrel." "You told me you admired flounces, and these sleeves are all the fashion," said Ella, the tears again flowing in spite of herself. "Well, I do think Mary looks well in flounces," returned Henry. "But she is almost a head taller than you, and better proportioned every way." Ella longed to remind him of a time when he called her sister a hay-pole, while he likened herself to a little sylph, fairy, etc., but she dared not, and Henry, bent on finding fault, touched her white bare shoulder, saying, "I wish you wouldn't wear such dresses. Mary don't, except at parties, and I heard a gentleman say that she displayed better taste than any young lady of his acquaintance." Ella was thoroughly angry, and amid a fresh shower of tears exclaimed, "Mary, Mary! I'm sick of the name. It's nothing but Mary, Mary, all day long with Mrs. Campbell, and now you must thrust her in my face. If you think her so perfect, why don't you marry her instead of me?" "Simply because she won't have me," returned Henry. And then, not wishing to provoke Ella too far, he playfully threw his arm around her waist, adding, "But come, my little beauty, don't let's quarrel any more about her. I ought to like my sister, and you shouldn't be jealous, so throw on your cloak and let's be off." "Oh no, not yet. It's too early," answered Ella, nothing loath to have an hour alone with him. So they sat down together upon the sofa, and after asking about Rose and how long Jenny was to remain in Glenwood, Ella, chancing to think of the strange discovery that day made with regard to herself and Mary, mentioned it to Henry, who seemed much more excited about it than she had been. "Mrs. Campbell, your mother's sister," said he, "and Mary's aunt too. Why didn't you tell me before?" "Because I didn't think of it," returned Ella. "And it's nothing so very marvellous either, or at least it does not affect me in the least." Henry did not reply, but there was that passing through his mind which might affect Ella not a little. As the reader knows, he was marrying her for her money, and now if that money was to be shared with another, the bride lost half her value. But such thoughts must not be expressed, and when Henry next spoke, he said very calmly, "Well, I'm glad on Mary's account, for your aunt will undoubtedly share her fortune with her." And Henry's eyes turned upon Ella with a deeper meaning than she could divine. It was so long since Ella had felt the need of money that she had almost ceased to know its value, and besides this, she had no suspicion of Henry's motive in questioning her, so she carelessly replied that nothing had been said on the subject, though she presumed her aunt would make Mary heiress with herself, as she had recently taken a violent fancy to her. Here the conversation flagged, and Henry fell into a musing mood, from which Ella was forced to rouse him when it was time to go. As if their thoughts were flowing in the same channel, Mrs. Campbell that evening was thinking of Mary and trying to devise some means by which to atone for neglecting her so long. Suddenly a new idea occurred to her, upon which she determined immediately to act, and the next morning Mr. Worthington was sent for to draw up a new will in which Mary Howard was to share equally with her sister. "Half of all I own is theirs by right," said she, "and what I want is that on their 21st birthday they shall come into possession of the portion which ought to have been their mother's, while at my death the remainder shall be equally divided between them." The will was accordingly drawn up, signed and sealed, Mr. Worthington keeping a rough draft of it, which was thrown among some loose papers in his office. A few afterwards, Henry, coming accidentally upon it, read it without any hesitation. "That settles it at once," said he, "and I can't say I'm sorry, for I was getting horribly sick of her. Now, I'd willingly marry Mary without a penny, but Ella, with only 1/4 as much as I expected, and that not until she's 21, is a different matter entirely. But what am I to do? I wish Morland was here, for though he don't like me, and I wonder who does, he wouldn't mind lending me a few thousand. Well, there's no help for it, and the sooner the old man breaks now, the better. It'll help me out of a deuced mean scrape, for of course I shall be magnanimous and release Ella at once from her engagement with a ruined man." The news that Mary was Mrs. Campbell's niece spread rapidly, and among those who came to congratulate her, none was more sincere than William Bender. Mary was very dear to him, and whatever conduced to her happiness added also to his. Together with her, he had heard the rumour of Mr. Lincoln's downfall, and while he felt sorry for the family, he could not help hoping that it would bring Jenny nearer to him. Of this he told Mary, who hardly dared trust herself to reply, lest she should divulge a darling secret, which she had cherished ever since Mrs. Campbell had told her that, in little more than a year, she was to be the rightful owner of a sum of money much larger than she had ever dreamed it possible for her to possess. Wholly unselfish, her thoughts instantly turned towards her adopted brother. A part of that sum should be his, and with that for a stepping stone to future wealth, Mrs. Lincoln, when poor and destitute, could no longer refuse him her daughter. Mrs. Campbell, to whom alone she confided her wishes, gave her consent, though she could not understand the self-denying love which prompted this act of generosity to a stranger. And now Mary was very happy in thinking how much good she could do. Mrs. Mason, her benefactress, should never want again. Sally Furbush, the kind-hearted old crazy woman who had stood by her so long and so faithfully, should share her home wherever that home might be, while better than all the rest, William Bender, the truest, best friend she ever had, should be repaid for his kindness to her when a little unknown pauper. And still the world, knowing nothing of the hidden causes which made Mary's laugh so merry and her manner so gay, said that the prospect of being an heiress had turned her head, just as it always did those who were suddenly elevated to wealth. End of chapter 29.
Chapter 30 of The English Orphans, or A Home in the New World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Lisa Rose. The English Orphans, or A Home in the New World, by Mary Jane Holmes. The Crisis. Mr. Lincoln had failed. At the corners of the streets, groups of men stood together, talking over the matter and ascribing it, some to his carelessness, some to his extreme good nature in endorsing for anyone who asked, and others, the knowing ones, winking slyly as they said they guessed they knew what he was about. They'd known before of such things as failing rich. But the mouths of these last were stopped when they heard that the household furniture, everything, was given up for the benefit of his creditors, and was to be sold at auction during the coming week. In their parlors at home, wives and daughters also discussed the matter, always ending by accusing Mrs. Lincoln of unwarrantable extravagance and wondering how the proud Rose would bear it, and suggesting that she could work in the factory just as her mother did. It was strange how suddenly Mrs. Lincoln's most intimate friends discovered that she had once been a poor factory girl, remembering, too, that they had often noticed an air of vulgarity about her. Even Mrs. Campbell was astonished that she should have been so deceived, though she pitied the daughters, who were really refined and ladylike, considering. And then she thought of Henry, hoping that Ella would be now willing to give him up. But with a devotion worthy of a better object, Ella replied that he was dearer to her than ever. "I have not loved him for his wealth," said she, "and I shall not forsake him now." And then she wondered why he stayed so long away, as day after day went by, and still he came not. It was in vain that Mary, who visited the house frequently, told her of many things which might detain him. Ella saw but one. He fancied she, too, would desert him, like the cold, unfeeling world. And then she begged so imploringly of her sister to go to him and ask him to come, that Mary, loath as she was to do so, finally complied. She found him in his office, and fortunately alone. He was looking very pale and haggard, the result of last night's debauch. But Mary did not know of this. She only saw grief for his misfortune, and her voice and manner were far more cordial than usual as she bade him good afternoon. "It is kind in you, Miss Howard, to come here," said he, nervously pressing the hand she offered. "I knew you would not forsake me, and I'd rather have your sympathy than that of the whole world." Wishing to end such conversation, Mary replied, "I came here, Mr. Lincoln, at Ella's request. Ever since your father's failure, she has waited anxiously for you." She was prevented from saying more by Henry, who, with a feigned bitterness of manner, exclaimed, "Ella need not feel troubled, for I am too honorable to insist upon her keeping an engagement, which I would to heaven had never been made. Tell her she is free to do as she pleases." "You are mistaken, sir," answered Mary. "Ella does not wish to be free, but come with me. I promise to bring you." With an air of desperation, Henry took his hat and started with Mary for Mrs. Campbell's. Oh, how eagerly Ella sprang forward to meet him, and burying her face in his bosom, she sobbed like a child. "Hush, Ella, this is foolish," said he, and then seating her in a chair, he asked why he was sent for. "I was afraid you might think I did not love you now," answered Ella. "I could not blame you if you did not," said Henry. "Matters have changed since we last met, and I'm not mean enough to expect you to keep your engagement." "But if I expect it, if I wish it?" asked Ella, raising her tear-wet eyes to his face. "You are excited now," said he, "but in a few days you'll thank me for my decision. An alliance with poverty could be productive of nothing but unhappiness to you. And while I thank you for your unselfish love, I cannot accept it, for I am determined that, so long as I am poor, I shall never marry. And the sooner you forget me, the better, for, Ella, I am not deserving of your love." Then, with a cold adieu, he left her, and when, half an hour afterwards, Mary entered the parlor, she found her sister lying upon the sofa, perfectly motionless, except when a tremor of anguish shook her slight frame. A few words explained all, and taking her head in her lap, Mary tried to soothe her. But Ella refused to be comforted, and as she seemed to prefer being alone, Mary ere long left her and bent her steps towards Mr. Lincoln's dwelling, which presented a scene of strange confusion. The next day was the auction, and many people of both sexes had assembled to examine and find fault with the numerous articles of furniture which were being removed to the auction room. "Where's them silver candlesticks and that cake basket that cost upwards of $100? asked one fussy, vulgar-looking old woman, peering into closets and cupboards and even lifting trunk lids in her search. I want some such things, and if they go for half price or less, mebbe Israel will bid. But I don't see 'em. I'll warrant they've hit 'em." Mary was just in time to hear this remark, and she modestly replied that Mr. Lincoln's creditors had generously presented him with all the silver, which was now at Mr. Selden's. The woman stared impudently at her a moment, and then said, "Now that's what I call downright cheatin'. What business has poor folks with so much silver? Better pay their debts first, that's my creed." Mary turned away in disgust, but not until she heard the woman's daughter whisper, "Don't, Mother, that's Miss Howard, Mrs. Campbell's niece." To which the mother replied, "Wall, who cares for that? Glad I gin her a good one. Upper crust ain't no better than I be." Passing through the hall, where several other women were examining and depreciating Mrs. Lincoln's costly carpets, pronouncing them half cotton, etc., Mary made her way up the stairs, where in a chamber as yet untouched, she found Jenny, and with her William Bender. Mrs. Lincoln's cold, scrutinizing eyes were away, and Mr. Lincoln had cordially welcomed William to his house, telling him of his own accord where his daughter could be found. Many a time in his life, for Mary's sake, had William wished that he was rich, but never had he felt so intense a longing for money as he did when Jenny sat weeping at his side, and starting at each new sound which came up from the rabble below. "Oh, Mary, Mary," she said, as the latter entered the room, "tomorrow everything will be sold, and I shall have no home. It's dreadful to be poor." Mary knew that from bitter experience, and sitting down by her young friend, her tears flowed as freely as Jenny's had often flowed for her in the gray old woods near Chicopee Poorhouse. Just then there was an unusual movement in the yard below, and looking from the window, Jenny saw that they were carrying the piano away. "This is worse than all," said she. "If they only knew how dear that is to me, or how dear it will be when—" She could not finish, but Mary knew what she would say. The piano belonged to Rose, whose name was engraved upon its front, and when she was dead, it would from that fact be doubly dear to the sister. A stylish-looking carriage now drew up before the house, from which Mrs. Campbell alighted and, holding up her long skirts, ascended the stairs and knocked at Jenny's door. "Permeely," called out the old lady, who had been disappointed in her search for the silver candlesticks. "Wasn't that Miss Campbell? Well, she's gone right into one of them rooms where t'other gal went. I shouldn't wonder if Mr. Lincoln's best things was hid there, for they keep the door locked." Accidentally, Mr. Lincoln overheard this remark, and in his heart he felt that his choicest treasure was indeed there. His wife, from whom he naturally expected sympathy, had met him with desponding looks and bitter words, reproaching him with carelessness, and saying, as in similar circumstances ladies too often do, that she had foreseen it from the first, and that had he followed her advice, 'twould not have happened. Henry, too, seemed callous and indifferent, and the father alone found comfort in Jenny's words of love and encouragement. From the first she had stood bravely by him, refusing to leave the house until all was over, and many a weary night, when the great city was hushed and still, a light had gleamed from the apartment where, with her father, she sat looking over his papers and trying to ascertain, as far as possible, to what extent he was involved. It was she who first suggested the giving up of everything, and when Henry, less upright than his noble sister, proposed the withholding of a part, she firmly answered, "No, father, don't do it. You have lost your property, but do not lose your self-respect." Always cheerful, and sometimes even gay in his presence, she had succeeded in imbuing him with a portion of her own hopeful spirit, and he passed through the storm far better than he could otherwise have done. Mrs. Campbell's visit to the house was prompted partly from curiosity and partly from a desire to take away Jenny, who was quite a favorite with her. "Come, my dear," said she, pushing back the short, thick curls which clustered around Jenny's forehead. "You must go home with me. This is no place for you. Mary will go too," she continued, and then on an aside to Mary, she added, "I want you to cheer up Ella. She sits alone in her room without speaking or noticing me in any way." At first Jenny hesitated, but when William whispered that she had better go, and Mrs. Campbell, as the surest way of bringing her to a decision, said, "Mr. Bender will oblige me by coming to tea," she consented, and closely veiled passed through the crowd below, who instinctively drew back and ceased speaking, for wherever she was known, Jenny was beloved. Arrived at Mrs. Campbell's, they found Ella, as her mother had said, sitting alone in her room, not weeping, but gazing fixedly down the street as if expecting someone who did not come. In reply to Jenny's anxious inquiries as to what was the matter, Mary frankly told all, and then Jenny, folding her arms around the young girl, longed to tell her how unworthy was the object of such love. But Henry was her brother, and she could not. Softly caressing Ella's cheek, she whispered to her of brighter days which perhaps would come. The fact that it was his sister, Henry's sister, opened anew the fountain of Ella's tears, and she wept for a long time. But it did her good, and for the remainder of the afternoon she seemed more cheerful and inclined to converse. The next day was the auction, and it required the persuasion of both Mrs. Campbell and Mary to keep Jenny from going. She knew not whither herself, but anywhere, to be near and take one more look at the dear old furniture as it passed into the hands of strangers. At last Mrs. Campbell promised that Black Ezra, who had accompanied her from Chicopee, should go and report faithfully all the proceedings, and then Jenny consented to remain at home, though all the day she seemed restless and impatient, wondering how long before Uncle Ezra would return. And then, weeping as in fancy, she saw article after article disposed of to those who would know little how to prize it. About 5 o'clock Uncle Ezra came home, bringing a note from Ida, saying that the carriage would soon be round for Mary and Jenny, both of whom must surely come, as there was a pleasant surprise awaiting them. While Mary was reading this, Jenny was eagerly questioning Uncle Ezra with regard to the sale, which he said went off uncommon well, owing chiefly, he reckoned, to a tall and mighty good-looking chap, who kept bidding up and up till he got 'em about where they should be. Then he'd stop for someone else to bid. "Who was he?" asked Mary, coming forward and joining Jenny. "Dunno, miss. Never seen him afore," said Uncle Ezra. "But he's got heaps of money, for when he paid for the pianner, he took out a roll of bills near about big as my 2 fists. "Then the piano is gone," said Jenny sadly, while Mary asked how much it brought. $300 was the last bid I heard from that young feller, and somebody who was bidding agin him said 'twas more'n 'twas worth." "It wasn't either," spoke up Jenny, rather spiritedly. "It cost $500, and it's never been hurt a bit." "Mr. Bender bought that little fiddle of yourn," continued Uncle Ezra, with a peculiar wink, which brought the color to Jenny's cheeks, while Mary exclaimed, "Oh, I'm so glad you can have your guitar again." Here the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the carriage, which came for the young ladies, who were soon on their way to Mr. Selden's, Mary wondering what the surprise was, and Jenny hoping William would call in the evening. At the door they met Ida, who was unusually merry, almost too much so for the occasion, it seemed to Mary, as she glanced at Jenny's pale, dispirited face. Aunt Martha, too, who chanced to cross the hall, shook Mary's hand as warmly as if she had not seen her for a year, and then, with her broad, white-capped strings flying back, she repaired to the kitchen to give orders concerning the supper. Mary did not notice it then, but she afterwards remembered that Ida seemed quite anxious about her appearance, for following her to her room, she said, "You look tired, Mary. Sit down and rest you a while. Here, take my vinaigrette. That will revive you." Then, as Mary was arranging her hair, she said, "Just puff out this side a little more. There, that's right. Now turn around. I want to see how you look." "Well, how do I?" asked Mary, facing about as Ida directed. "I guess you'll do," returned Ida. "I believe Henry Lincoln was right when he said that this balloon merino and linen collar was the most becoming dress you could wear. But you look well in everything. You have so fine a form." "Don't believe all her flattery," said Jenny laughingly. "She's only comparing your tall, slender figure with little dumpy me. But I'm growing thin, see?" And she lapped her dress 2 or 3 inches in front. "Come now, let's go down," said Ida. and I'll introduce you to Jenny's surprise first." With Ida leading the way, they entered the music room, where in one corner stood Rose's piano, open and apparently inviting Jenny to its side. With a joyful cry, she sprang forward, exclaiming, "Oh, how kind in your father! I almost know we can redeem it sometime. I'll teach school, anything to get it again." "Don't thank father too much," answered Ida, "for he has nothing to do with it, except giving it house room, and 1/4's teaching will pay that bill." "Who did buy it, then?" asked Jenny, and Ida replied, "Can't tell you just yet. I must have some music first. Come, Mary, you like to play. Give me my favorite, Rosalie with variations." Mary was passionately fond of music, and, for the time she had taken lessons, played uncommonly well. Seating herself at the piano, she became oblivious to all else around her, and when a tall figure for a moment darkened the doorway, while Jenny uttered a suppressed exclamation of surprise, she paid no heed, nor did she become conscious of a third person's presence until the group advanced towards her, Ida and Jenny leaning upon the piano, and the other standing at her right, a little in the rear. Thinking, if she thought at all, that it was William Bender, Mary played on until the piece was finished, and then, observing that her companions had left the room, she turned and met the dark, handsome eyes, not of William Bender, but of one who, with a peculiar smile, offered her his hand, saying, "I believe I need no introduction to Miss Howard, except a slight change in the name, which, instead of being Stewart, is Morland." Mary never knew what she said or did. She only remembered a dizzy sensation in her head. A strong arm passed around her, and a voice which fully aroused her as it called her "Mary," and asked if she were faint. Just then Ida entered the room, announcing tea, and asking her if she found Mr. Stewart much changed. At the tea table, Mary sat opposite George, and every time she raised her eyes, she met his fixed upon her, with an expression so like that of the picture in the golden locket, which she still wore, that she wondered she had not before recognized George Morland in the Mr. Stewart who had so puzzled and mystified her. After supper she had an opportunity of seeing why George was so much beloved at home. Possessing rare powers of conversation, he seemed to know exactly what to say and when to say it, and with a kind word and pleasant smile for all, he generally managed to make himself a favorite, notwithstanding his propensity to tease, which would occasionally show itself in some way or other. During the evening William Bender called, and soon after Henry Lincoln also came in. Frowning gloomily when he saw how near to each other were William and his sister, while he jealously watched them, still keeping an eye upon George and Mary, the latter of whom remembered her young sister and treated him with unusual coldness. At last, complaining of feeling blue, he asked Ida to play, at the same time sauntering towards the music room, where stood his sister's piano. "Upon my word," said he, "this looks natural. Who bought it?" And he drummed a few notes of a song. "Mr. Morland bought it. Wasn't he kind?" said Jenny, who all the evening had been trying for a chance to thank George, but now when she attempted to do so, he prevented her by saying, "Oh, don't. I can imagine all you wish to say, and I hate to be thanked. Rose and I are particular friends, and it afforded me a great deal of pleasure to purchase it for her. But," he added, glancing at his watch, "I must be excused now, as I promised to call upon my ward." "Who's that?" asked Jenny, and George replied that it was a Miss Herndon, who had accompanied him from New Orleans to visit her aunt, Mrs. Russell. "He says she's an heiress and very beautiful," rejoined Ida, seating herself at the piano. Instantly catching at the words heiress and beautiful, Henry started up, asking if it would be against all the rules of propriety for him to call upon her thus early. "I think it would," was George's brief answer, while Mary's eyes flashed scornfully upon the young man, who, rather crestfallen, announced himself ready to listen to Ida, whom he secretly styled an old maid, because since his first remembrance she had treated him with perfect indifference. That night, before retiring, the three girls sat down by the cheerful fire in Mary's room to talk over the events of the day. when Mary suddenly asked Ida to tell her truly if it were not George who had paid her bills at Mount Holyoke. "What bills?" said Jenny, to whom the idea was new, while Ida replied, "And suppose it was?" "I'm sorry," answered Mary, laying her head upon the table. "What a silly girl," said Ida. "He was perfectly able and more than willing, so why do you care?" "I do not like being so much indebted to anyone," was Mary's reply, and yet in her secret heart there was a strange feeling of pleasure in the idea that George had thus cared for her. For would he have done so if— She dared not finish that question, even to herself, dared not ask if she hoped that George Morland loved her one half as well as she began to think she had always loved him. Why should he, with his handsome person and princely fortune, love one so unworthy and so much beneath him? And then, for the first time, she thought of her changed position since last they met. Then she was a poor, obscure schoolmistress, now flattered, caressed, and an heiress. Years before, when a little pauperette Chicopee, she had felt unwilling that George should know how destitute she was, and now in the time of her prosperity, she was equally desirous that he should, for a time at least, remain ignorant of her present condition. "Ida," said she, lifting her head from the table, "does George know that I am Mrs. Campbell's niece?" "No," answered Ida. "I wanted to tell him, but Aunt Martha said I'd better not." "Don't then," returned Mary, and resuming her former position, she fell into a deep reverie, from which she was at last aroused by Jenny's asking if she intended to sit up all night. The news that George Morland had returned and bought Rose Lincoln's piano, besides several other articles, spread rapidly, and the day following his arrival Mary and Ida were stopped in the street by a group of their companions, who were eager to know how George bore the news that his betrothed was so ill, and if it was not that which had brought him home so soon. And then the conversation turned upon Miss Herndon, the New Orleans lady who had that morning appeared in the street. "And don't you think," said one of the girls, "that Henry Lincoln was dancing attendance upon her? If I were you," turning to Mary, "I'd caution my sister to be a little wary of him. But let me see, their marriage is to take place soon?" Mary replied that the marriage was postponed indefinitely, whereupon the girls exchanged meaning glances and passed on. In less than 24 hours, half of Ella's acquaintances were talking of her discarding Henry on account of his father's failure, and saying that they expected it, 'twas like her. Ere long the report, in the shape of a condolence, reached Henry, who, caring but little what reason was assigned for the broken engagement, so that he got well out of it, assumed a much injured air, but said he reckoned he should manage to survive. Then pulling his sharp-pointed collar up another story and brushing his pet mustache, wherein lay most of his mind, he walked up street and, ringing at Mrs. Russell's door, asked for Miss Herndon, who, vain as beautiful, suffered his attentions, not because she liked him in the least, but because she was fond of flattery, and there was something exceedingly gratifying in the fact that at the North, where she fancied the gentlemen to be icicles, she had so soon made a conquest. It mattered not that Mrs. Russell told her his vows were plighted to another. She cared nothing for that. Her life had been one long series of conquest, until now at 25 there was not in the whole world a more finished or heartless coquette than Erin Herndon. Days passed on, and at last rumors reached Ella that Henry was constant in his attendance upon the proud Southern beauty, whose fortune was valued by hundreds of thousands. At first she refused to believe it, but when Mary and Jenny both assured her it was true, and when she herself had ocular demonstration of the fact, she gave way to one long fit of weeping, and then, drying her eyes, declared that Henry Lincoln should see that she would not die for him. Still, a minute observer could easily have seen that her gaiety was feigned, for she had loved Henry Lincoln as sincerely as she was capable of loving, and not even George Morland, who treated her with his old boyish familiarity, could make her for a moment forget one who now passed her coldly by, or listen passively while the sarcastic Erin Herndon likened her to a waxen image fit only for a glass case. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of The English Orphans, or A Home in the New World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Lisa Rose. The English Orphans, or A Home in the New World, by Mary Jane Holmes. A question. Towards the last of April, Mrs. Mason and Mary returned to their old home in the country. On Ella's account, Mrs. Campbell had decided to remain in the city during a part of the summer, and she labored hard to keep Mary also, offering as a last inducement to give Mrs. Mason a home too. But Mrs. Mason preferred her own house in Chicopee, and thither Mary accompanied her, promising, however, to spend the next winter with her aunt, who wept at parting with her more than she would probably have done had it been Ella. Mary had partially engaged to teach the school in Rice Corner, but George, assuming a kind of authority over her, declared she should not. "I don't want your eyes to grow dim and your cheeks pale in that little pent-up room," said he. "You know, I've been there, and I've seen for myself." Mary colored, for George's manner of late had puzzled her, and Jenny had more than once whispered in her ear, "I know George loves you, for he looks at you just as William does at me, only a little more so." Ida, too, had once mischievously addressed her as cousin, adding that there was no one among her acquaintances whom she would as willingly call by that name. "When I was a little girl," said she, "they used to tease me about George, but I'd as soon think of marrying my brother." "You never saw Mr. Elwood, George's classmate, for he's in Europe now. Between you and me, I like him, and—" A loud call from Aunt Martha prevented Ida from finishing, and the conversation was not again resumed. The next morning Mary was to leave, and as she stood in the parlor talking with Ida, George came in with a traveling satchel in his hand, and a shawl thrown carelessly over his arm. "Where are you going?" asked Ida. "To Springfield. I have business there," said George. "And when will you return?" continued Ida, feeling that it would be doubly lonely at home. "That depends on circumstances," said he. "I shall stop at Chicopee on my way back, provided Mary is willing." Mary answered that she was always glad to see her friends, and as the carriage just then drove up, they started together for the depot. Mary never remembered of having had a more pleasant ride than that from Boston to Chicopee. George was a most agreeable companion, and with him at her side she seemed to discover new beauties in every object which they passed, and felt rather sorry when the winding river and the blue waters of Podunk Pond warned her that Chicopee Station was near at hand. "I shall see you next week," said George, as he handed her from the cars, which the next moment rolled over the long meadow and disappeared through the deep cut in the sandy hillside. For a week or more Judith had been at Mrs. Mason's house, putting things to rights, and when the travelers arrived they found everything in order. A cheerful fire was blazing in the little parlor, and before it stood the tea-table nicely arranged, while two beautiful Malta kittens, which during the winter had been Judith's special care, lay upon the hearth-rug asleep, with their soft velvet paws locked lovingly around each other's neck. "Oh, how pleasant to be at home once more, and alone," said Mrs. Mason, but Mary did not reply. Her thoughts were elsewhere, and much as she liked being alone, the presence of a certain individual would not probably have marred her happiness to any great extent. But he was coming soon, and with that in anticipation she appeared cheerful and gay as usual. Among the first to call upon them was Mrs. Perkins, who came early in the morning, bringing her knitting work and staying all day. She had taken to dressmaking, she said, and thought maybe she could get some new ideas from Mary's dresses, which she very coolly asked to see. With the utmost good humor, Mary opened her entire wardrobe to the inspection of the widow, who, having recently forsaken the Unitarian faith and gone over to the new Methodist church in River Street, turned conscientiously away from the gay party dresses, wondering how sensible people, to say nothing of Christian people, could find pleasure in such vanities. "But then," said she, I hear you've joined the Episcopals, and that accounts for it, for they allow of most anything, and in my opinion ain't a whit better than the Catholics." "Why, we are Catholic, ain't you?" asked Mary. The knitting work dropped, and with a short ejaculatory prayer of "Good Lord," Mrs. Perkins exclaimed, "Well, I'm glad you've owned up. Half on 'em deny it, but there 'tis in black and white in the prayer book. I believe in the Holy Catholic Church." It was in vain that Mary referred her to the dictionary for a definition of the word Catholic. She knew all she wanted to know, and she shouldn't wonder, being 'twas Friday, if Miss Mason didn't have no meat for dinner. The appearance of a nicely roasted bit of veal quieted her fears on that subject, and as the effects of the strong green tea became apparent, she said, like enough she'd been too hard on the Episcopals, for to tell the truth, she never felt so solemn in her life as she did the time she went to one of their meetings. But, she added, I do object to them 2 gowns, and I can't help it. At last the day was over, and with it the visit of the widow, who had gathered enough gossiping materials to last her until the Monday following, when the arrival in the neighborhood of George Morland threw her upon a fresh theme, causing her to wonder if 'twain't Mary's beau, and if he hadn't been kinder courting her ever since the time he visited her school. She felt sure of it when, towards evening, she saw them enter the schoolhouse, and nothing but the presence of a visitor prevented her from stealing across the road and listening under the window. She would undoubtedly have been highly edified could she have heard their conversation. The interest which George had felt in Mary when a little child was greatly increased when he visited her school in Rice Corner, and saw how much she was improved in her manners and appearance. And it was then that he conceived the idea of educating her, determining to marry her if she proved to be all he hoped she would. That she did meet his expectations was evident from the fact that his object in stopping at Chicopee was to settle a question which she alone could decide. He had asked her to accompany him to the schoolhouse, because it was there his resolution had been formed, and it was there he would make it known. Mary, too, had something which she wished to say to him. She would thank him for his kindness to her and her parents' memory. But the moment she commenced talking upon the subject, George stopped her, and for the first time since they were children, placed his arm around her waist, and kissing her smooth white brow, said, "Shall I tell you, Mary, how you can repay it?" She did not reply, and he continued, "Give me a husband's right to care for you, and I shall be repaid 1,000-fold." Whatever Mary's answer might have been, and indeed we are not sure that she answered at all, George was satisfied, and when he told her how dear she was to him, how long he had loved her, and asked if he might not hope that he, too, had been remembered, the little golden locket which she placed in his hand was a sufficient reply. Without Ida's aid, he had heard of the relationship existing between Mrs. Campbell and Mary, but it made no difference with him. His mind had long been made up, and in taking Mary for his wife, he felt that he was receiving the best of heaven's blessings. Until the shadows of evening fell around them, they sat there, talking of the future, which George said should be all one bright dream of happiness to the young girl at his side, whom from the very fullness of her joy wept as she thought how strange it was that she should be the wife of George Morland, whom many a dashing belle had tried in vain to win. The next morning George went back to Boston, promising to return in a week or 2, when he should expect Mary to accompany him to Glenwood, as he wished to see Rose once more before she died. End of chapter 31.
Chapter 32 of the English Orphans, or A Home in the New World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Laura Luchsinger. The English Orphans, or A Home in the New World, by Mary Jane Holmes. Chapter 32. Going Home. The windows of Rose Lincoln's chamber were open, and the balmy air of May came in, kissing the white brow of the sick girl, and whispering to her of swelling buds and fair young blossoms, which its breath had wakened into life and which she would never see. "Has Henry come?" she asked of her father, and in the tones of her voice there was an unusual gentleness, for just as she was dying, Rose was learning to live. For a time she had seemed so indifferent and obstinate that Mrs. Howland had almost despaired. But night after night, when her daughter thought she slept, she prayed for the young girl that she might not die until she had first learned the way of eternal life. And, as if in answer to her prayers, Rose gradually began to listen, and as she listened, she wept, wondering though why her grandmother thought her so much more wicked than anyone else. Again, in a sudden burst of passion, she would send her from the room, saying she had heard preaching enough, for she wasn't going to die. She wouldn't die anyway. But at last such feelings passed away, and as the sun of her short life was setting, the sun of righteousness shone more and more brightly over her pathway, lighting her through the dark valley of death. She no longer asked to be taken home, for she knew that could not be, but she wondered why her brother stayed so long from Glenwood when he knew that she was dying. On her return from the city, Jenny had told her as gently as possible of his conduct towards Ella and of her fears that he was becoming more dissipated than ever. For a time, Rose lay perfectly still, and Jenny, thinking she was asleep, was about to leave the room when her sister called her back, and bidding her sit down by her side, said, "Tell me, Jenny, do you think Henry has any love for me?" "He would be an unnatural brother if he had not," answered Jenny, her own heart yearning more tenderly towards her sister, whose gentle manner she could not understand. "Then," resumed Rose, "if he loves me, he will be sorry when I am dead, and perhaps it may save him from ruin." The tears dropped slowly from her long eyelashes, while Jenny, laying her round rosy cheek against the thin pale face near her, sobbed out, "You must not die, dear Rose, you must not die and leave us." From that time the failure was visible and rapid, and though letters went frequently to Henry, telling him of his sister's danger, he still lingered by the side of the brilliant beauty, while each morning Rose asked, "Will he come today?" And each night she wept that he was not there. Calmly and without a murmur, she had heard the story of their ruin from her father, who could not let her die without undeceiving her. Before that time she had asked to be taken back to Mount Auburn, designating the spot where she would be buried, but now she insisted upon being laid by the running brook at the foot of her grandmother's garden, and near a green, mossy bank where the spring blossoms were earliest found, and where the flowers of autumn lingered longest. The music of the falling water, she said, would soothe her as she slept, and its cool moisture keep the grass green and fresh upon her early grave. One day, when Mrs. Lincoln was sitting by her daughter and, as she frequently did, uttering invectives against Mount Holyoke and Company, Rose said, "Don't talk so, Mother. Mount Holyoke Seminary had nothing to do with hastening my death. I have done it myself by my own carelessness." And then she confessed how many times she had deceived her mother, and thoughtlessly exposed her health, even when her lungs and side were throbbing with pain. "I know you will forgive me," said she, "for most severely have I been punished." Then, as she heard Jenny's voice in the room below, she added, "There is one other thing which I would say to you. Ere I die, you must promise that Jenny shall marry William Bender. He is poor, I know, and so are we, but he has a noble heart, and now, for my sake, Mother, take back the bitter words you once spoke to Jenny, and say that she may wed him. She will soon be your only daughter, and why should you destroy her happiness? Promise me, Mother, promise that she shall marry him." Mrs. Lincoln, though poor, was proud and haughty still, and the struggle in her bosom was long and severe, but love for her dying child conquered at last, and to the oft-repeated question, "Promise me, Mother, will you not?" She answered, "Yes, Rose. Yes, for your sake I give my consent, though nothing else could ever have wrung it from me." "And, mother," continued Rose, "may he not be sent for now? I cannot be here long, and once more I would see him and tell him that I gladly claim him as a brother." A brother! How heavily those words smote upon the heart of the sick girl. Henry was yet away, and though in Jenny's letter Rose herself had once feebly traced the words, "Come, brother, do come," he still lingered, as if bound by a spell he could not break. And so days went by, and night succeeded night, until the bright May morning dawned, the last Rose could ever see. Slowly up the eastern horizon came the warm spring sun, and as its red beams danced for a time upon the wall of Rose's chamber, she gazed wistfully upon it, murmuring, "It is the last that will ever rise for me." William Bender was there. He had come the night before, bringing word that Henry would follow the next day. There was a gay party to which he had promised to attend Miss Herndon, and he deemed that a sufficient reason why he should neglect his dying sister, who every few minutes asked eagerly if he had come. Strong was the agony at work in the father's heart, and still he nerved himself to support his daughter while he watched the shadows of death as one by one they crept over her face. The mother, wholly overcome, declared she could not remain in the room, and on the lounge below she kept two of the neighbors constantly moving in quest of the restoratives which she fancied she needed. Poor Jenny, weary and pale with watching and tears, leaned heavily against William, and Rose, as often as her eyes unclosed and rested upon her, would whisper, "Jenny, dear Jenny, I wish I had loved you more." Grandma Howland had laid many a dear one in the grave, and as she saw another leaving her, she thought, how grew her store in heaven, and still her heart was quivering with anguish, for Rose had grown strongly into her affection. But for the sake of the other stricken ones she hushed her own grief, knowing it would not be long ere she met her child again. And truly it seemed more meet that she with her gray hair and dim eyes should die even then than that Rose, with the dew of youth still glistening upon her brow, should thus early be laid low. "If Henry does not come," said Rose, "tell him it was my last request that he turn away from the wine cup, and say that the bitterest pang I felt in dying was a fear that my only brother should fill a drunkard's grave. He cannot look upon me dead and feel angry that I wished him to reform. And as he stands over my coffin, tell him to promise never again to touch the deadly poison." Here she became too much exhausted to say more, and soon after fell into a quiet sleep. When she awoke, her father was sitting across the room, with his head resting upon the window-sill, while her own was pillowed upon the strong arm of George Morland, who bent tenderly over her and soothed her as he would a child. Quickly her fading cheek glowed, and her eyes sparkled with something of its olden light. But George, George, was all she had strength to say, and when Mary, who had accompanied him, approached her, she only knew that she was recognized by the pressure of the little blue-veined hand, which soon dropped heavily upon the counterpane, while the eyelids closed languidly, and with the words, "He will not come," she again slept. But this time 'twas the long, deep sleep from which she would never awaken. Slowly the shades of night fell around the cottage where death had so lately left its impress. Softly the kind-hearted neighbors passed up and down the narrow staircase, ministering first to the dead, and then turning aside to weep as they looked upon the bowed man who, with his head upon the window-sill, still sat just as he did when they told him she was dead. At his feet, on a little stool, was Jenny, pressing his hands and covering them with the tears she, for his sake, tried in vain to repress. At last, when it was dark without, and lights were burning upon the table, there was the sound of someone at the gate, and in a moment Henry stepped across the threshold, but started and turned pale when he saw his mother in violent hysterics upon the lounge, and Mary Howard bathing her head and trying to soothe her. Before he had time to ask a question, Jenny's arms were wound around his neck, and she whispered, "Rose is dead. Why were you so late?" He could not answer. He had nothing to say, and mechanically following his sister, he entered the room where Rose had died. Very beautiful had she been in life, and now, far more beautiful in death, she looked like a piece of sculptured marble, as she lay there so cold and still, and all unconscious of the scalding tears which fell upon her face, as Henry bent over her, kissing her lips and calling upon her to awake and speak to him once more. When she thought he could bear it, Jenny told him of all Rose had said, and by the side of her coffin, with his hand resting upon her white forehead, the conscience-stricken young man swore that never again should ardent spirits of any kind pass his lips, and the father, who stood by and heard that vow, felt that if it were kept, his daughter had not died in vain. The day following the burial, George and Mary returned to Chicopee, and as the next day was the one appointed for the sale of Mr. Lincoln's farm and country house, he also accompanied them. "Suppose you buy it," said he to George as they rode over the premises. "I'd rather you own it than to see it in the hands of strangers." "I intended doing so," answered George, and when at night he was the owner of the farm, house, and furniture, he generously offered it to Mr. Lincoln rent-free, with the privilege of redeeming it whenever he could. This was so unexpected that Mr. Lincoln at first could hardly find words to express his thanks, but when he did, he accepted the offer, saying, however, that he could pay the rent, and adding that he hoped 2 or 3 years of hard labor in California, whither he intended going, would enable him to purchase it back. On his return to Glenwood, he asked William, who was still there, how he would like to turn farmer for a while. Jenny looked up in surprise, while William asked what he meant. Briefly, then, Mr. Lincoln told of George's generosity, and stating his own intentions of going to California, said that in his absence somebody must look after the farm, and he knew of no one whom he would as soon trust as William. "Oh, that'll be nice," said Jenny, whose love for the country was as strong as ever. "And then, Willie, when Pa comes back, we'll go to Boston again and practice law, you and I." William pressed the little fat hand which had slid into his, and replied that much as he would like to oblige Mr. Lincoln, he could not willingly abandon his profession, in which he was succeeding even beyond his most sanguine hopes. "But," said he, "I think I can find a good substitute in Mr. Parker, who is anxious to leave the poorhouse. He is an honest, thorough-going man, and his wife, who is an excellent housekeeper, will relieve Mrs. Lincoln entirely from care." "Mercy!" exclaimed the last-mentioned lady. "I can never endure that vulgar creature round me. First, I'd know she'd want to be eating at the same table, and I couldn't survive that." Mr. Lincoln looked sad. Jenny smiled, and William replied that he presumed Mrs. Parker herself would greatly prefer taking her meals quietly with her husband in the kitchen. "We can at least try it," said Mr. Lincoln, in a manner so decided that his wife ventured no farther remonstrance, though she cried and fretted all the time, seemingly lamenting their fallen fortune, more than the vacancy which death had so recently made in their midst. Mr. Parker, who was weary of the poorhouse, gladly consented to take charge of Mr. Lincoln's farm, and in the course of a week or two, Jenny and her mother went out to their old home, where everything seemed just as they had left it the autumn before. The furniture was untouched, and in the front parlor stood Rose's piano and Jenny's guitar, which had been forwarded from Boston. Mr. Lincoln urged his mother-in-law to accompany them, but she shook her head, saying, "The old bees never left their hives," and she preferred remaining in Glenwood. Contrary to Mrs. Lincoln's fears, Sally Ann made no advances whatever towards an intimate acquaintance, and frequently days and even weeks would elapse without her ever seeing her mistress, who spent nearly all her time in her chamber, musing upon her past greatness and scolding Jenny because she was not more exclusive. While the family were making arrangements to move from Glenwood to Chicopee, Henry, for the first time in his life, began to see of how little use he was to himself or anyone else. Nothing was expected of him, consequently nothing was asked of him, and as his father made plans for the future, he began to wonder how he himself was henceforth to exist. His father would be in California, and he had too much pride to lounge around the old homestead which had come to them through George Moreland's generosity. Suddenly it occurred to him that he too would go with his father. He would help him repair their fortune. He would not be in the way of so much temptation as at home. He would be a man, and when he returned home, Hope painted a joyful meeting with his mother and Jenny, who should be proud to acknowledge him as a son and brother. Mr. Lincoln warmly seconded his resolution, which possibly would have never been carried out had not Henry heard of Miss Herndon's engagement with a rich old bachelor whom he had often heard her ridicule. Cursing the fickleness of the fair lady, and half wishing that he had not broken with Ella, whose fortune, though not what he had expected, was considerable, he bade adieu to his native sky, and 2 weeks after the family removed to Chicopee, he sailed with his father for the land of gold. But alas! The tempter was there before him, and in an unguarded moment he fell. The newly made grave, the narrow coffin, the pale, dead sister, and the solemn vow were all forgotten, and a debauch of 3 weeks was followed by a violent fever, which in a few days cut short his mortal career. He died alone, with none but his father to witness his wild ravings, in which he talked of his distant home, of Jenny and Rose, Mary Howard, and Ella, the last of whom he seemed now to love with a madness amounting almost to frenzy. Tearing out handfuls of his rich brown hair, he thrust it into his father's hand, bidding him to carry it to Ella and tell her that the heart she had so earnestly coveted was hers in death. And the father, far more wretched now than when his firstborn daughter died, promised everything, and when his only son was dead, he laid him down to sleep beneath the blue sky of California, where not one of the many bitter tears shed for him in his far-off home could fall upon his lonely grave. End of Chapter 32. Chapter 33 of the English Orphans, or A Home in the New World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Laura Luchsinger. The English Orphans, or A Home in the New World, by Mary Jane Holmes. Chapter 33. Conclusion. Great was the excitement in Rice Corner when it was known that on the evening of the 10th of September a grand wedding would take place at the house of Mrs. Mason. Mary was to be married to the richest man in Boston, so the story ran, and what was better yet, many of the neighbors were to be invited. Almost every day, whether pleasant or not, Jenny Lincoln came over to discuss the matter, and to ask if it were not time to send for William, who was to be one of the groomsmen, while she, together with Ida, were to officiate as bridesmaids. In this last capacity Ella had been requested to act, but the tears came quickly to her large mournful eyes, and turning away she wondered how Mary could thus mock her grief. From one fashionable watering place to another Mrs. Campbell had taken her, and finding that nothing there had power to rouse her drooping energies, she had, towards the close of the summer, brought her back to Chicopee, hoping that old scenes and familiar faces would effect what novelty and excitement had failed to do. All unworthy as Henry Lincoln had been, his sad death had cast a dark shadow across Ella's pathway. Hour after hour would she sit, gazing upon the locks of shining hair, which over land and sea had come to her in a letter from the father, who told her of the closing scene, when Henry called for her to cool the heat of his fevered brow. Every word and look of tenderness was treasured up, and the belief fondly cherished that he had always loved her thus, else why in the last fearful struggle was she alone remembered of all the dear ones in his distant home? Not even the excitement of her sister's approaching marriage could awaken in her the least interest, and if it were mentioned in her presence she would weep, wondering what she had done that Mary should be so much happier than herself, and Mrs. Campbell, remembering the past, could but answer in her heart that it was just. Sometimes Ella accused her sister of neglect, saying she had no thought for anyone except George Morland and his elegant house in Boston. It was in vain that Mary strove to convince her of her mistake. She only shook her head, hoping her sister would never know what it was to be wretched and desolate as she was. Mary could have told her of many weary days and sleepless nights, when there shone no star of hope in her dark sky, and when even her only sister turned from her in scorn. But she would not, and wiping away the tears which Ella's unkindness had called forth, she went back to her home, where busy preparations were making for her bridal. Never before had Mrs. Perkins, or the neighborhood generally, had so much upon their hands at one time. 2 dressmakers were sewing for Mary. A colored cook, with a flaming red turban, came up from Worcester to superintend the culinary department, and a week before the wedding, Aunt Martha also arrived, bringing with her a quantity of cut glass of all sizes and dimensions, the uses of which could not even be guessed, though the widow declared upon her honor, a virtue by which she always swore, that 2 of them were called cellar dishes, adding that the Lord only knew what that was. With all her quizzing, prying, and peeking, Mrs. Perkins was unable to learn anything definite with regard to the wedding dress, and as a last resort she appealed to Jenny, who of course ought to know, seeing as she was going to stand up with 'em. "Oh, yes, I know," said Jenny mischievously, and pulling from her pocket a bit of brown and white plaid silk, Mary's traveling dress, she passed it to the widow, who straightway wondered at Mary's taste in selecting that gingham-looking thing. Occasionally the widow felt some doubt as she heard rumors of pink brocades, India muslins, heavy silks, and embroidered merino morning gowns. But law, thought she, them are for the city. Anything'll do for the country, though I s'pose she'd want to look decent before all the Boston top-knots that are comin'. 3 days before the wedding, the widow's heart was made glad with a card of invitation, though she wondered why Mrs. Mason should say she would be at home. Of course she'd be to hum. What else should she be? It was amusing to see the airs which Mrs. Perkins took upon herself when conversing with some of her neighbors, who were not fortunate enough to be invited. They couldn't ask everybody, and 'twas natural for them to select from the best families. Her pride, however, received a fall when she learned that Sally Furbush had not only been invited and presented with a black silk dress for the occasion, but that George Morland, who arrived the day preceding the wedding, had gone for her himself, treating her with all the deference that he would the most distinguished lady. And truly, for once Sally acquitted herself with a great deal of credit, and remembering Miss Grundy's parting advice to keep her tongue between her teeth, she so far restrained her loquacity that a stranger would never have thought of her being crazy. The bridal day was bright, beautiful, and balmy, as the first days of September often are, and when the sun went down, the full silvery moon came softly up, as if to shower her blessings upon the nuptials about to be celebrated. Many and brilliant lights were flashing from the windows of Mrs. Mason's cottage, which seemed to enlarge its dimensions as one after another the guests came in. First and foremost was the widow with her rustling silk of silver gray and the red ribbons which she had sported at Sally Ann's wedding. After a series of maneuvers, she had succeeded in gaining a view of the supper table, and now, in a corner of the room, she was detailing the particulars to an attentive group of listeners. "The queerest things I ever see," said she, "and the queerest names, too. Why, at one end of the table is a muslin delaine puddin'." "A what?" asked 3 or 4 ladies in the same breath, and the widow replied, "Maybe I didn't get the name right. Let me see. No, come to think, it's a Charlotte somebody puddin' instead of a muslin delaine. And then at the other end of the table is what I should call a dish of hash. But Judith says it's chicken Sally, and it took the white meat of 6 or 7 chickens to make it. Now what in the world they'll ever do with all them legs and backs and things is more'n I can tell. But land's sake, there come some of the puckers. Is my cap on straight?" she continued, as Mrs. Campbell entered the room together with Ella and a number of Boston ladies. Being assured that her cap was all right, she resumed the conversation by directing the attention of those nearest her to Ella, and saying in a whisper, "If she hain't faded in a year, then I don't know, but poor thing, she's been disappointed, so it's no wonder." And thinking of her own experience with Mr. Parker, the widow's heart warmed toward the young girl, who, pale and languid, dropped into the nearest seat while her eyes moved listlessly about the room. The rich, showy dresses of the city people also came in for observation, and while the widow marveled at their taste in wearing collars as big as capes, she guessed that Mary'd feel flat in her checkered silk when she came to see everybody so dressed up. And now, guest after guest flitted down the narrow staircase and entered the parlor, which with the bedroom adjoining was soon filled. Ere long, Mr. Selden, who seemed to be master of ceremonies, appeared, and whispered something to those nearest the door. Immediately, the crowd fell back, leaving a vacant space in front of the mirror. The busy hum of voices died away, and only a few suppressed whispers of, "There! Look! See! Oh, my!" were heard as the bridal party took their places. The widow, being in the rear and rather short, slipped off her shoes and mounted into a chair for a better view, and when Mary appeared, she was very nearly guilty of an exclamation of surprise, for in place of the checkered silk was an elegant moire antique and an expensive bertha of point lace, while the costly bridal veil, which swept the floor and fell in soft folds on either side of her head, was confined to the heavy braids of her hair by diamond fastenings. A diamond necklace encircled her slender throat, and bracelets of the same shone upon her round white arms. The whole was the gift of George Morland, who had claimed the privilege of selecting and presenting the bridal dress, and who felt a pardonable pride when he saw how well it became Mary's graceful and rather queenly form. At her left stood her bridesmaids, Ida and Jenny, while at George's right were Mr. Elwood and William Bender, the latter of whom looked on calmly while the solemn words were spoken which gave the idol of his boyhood to another, and if he felt a momentary pang when he saw how fondly the newly made husband bent over his young bride, it passed away as his eye fell upon Jenny, who was now dearer to him, if possible, than Mary had ever been. Among the first to congratulate Mrs. Morland was Sally Furbush, followed by Mrs. Perkins, who whispered to George that she kinder had a notion how 'twould end when she first saw him in the schoolhouse, but I'm glad you've got him, turning to Mary, for it must be easier living in the city than keeping school. You'll have a hired girl, I suppose." When supper was announced, the widow made herself very useful in waiting upon the table, and asking some of the Boston ladies if they'd be helped to anything in them dishes, pointing to the finger glasses which now for the first time appeared in Rice Corner. The half-suppressed mirth of the ladies convinced the widow that she'd made a blunder, and perfectly disgusted with new-fangled fashions, she retreated into the kitchen, where she found things more to her taste, and thanked her stars she could, if she liked, eat with her fingers and wipe them on her pocket handkerchief. Soon after her engagement, Mary had asked that Sally should go with her to her city home. To this George willingly consented, and it was decided that she should remain with Mrs. Mason until the bridal party returned from the western tour they were intending to take. Sally knew nothing of this arrangement until the morning following the wedding, when she was told that she was not to return to the poorhouse again. "And verily I have this day met with a great deliverance," said she, and tears, the first shed in many a year, mingled with the old creature's thanks for this unexpected happiness. As Mary was leaving, she whispered in her ear, "If your travels lead you near Willie's grave, drop a tear on it for my sake. You'll find it under the buckeye tree where the tall grass and wild flowers grow." George had relatives in Chicago, and after spending a short time in that city, Mary, remembering Sally's request, expressed a desire to visit the spot renowned as the burial place of Willie and Willie's father. Ever ready to gratify her slightest wish, George consented, and towards the close of a mild autumnal day, they stopped at a small public house on the border of a vast prairie. The arrival of so distinguished-looking couple caused quite a commotion, and after duly inspecting Mary's handsome traveling dress and calculating its probable cost, the hostess departed to prepare the evening meal, which was soon forthcoming. When supper was over and the family had gathered into the pleasant sitting room, George asked if there was ever a man in those parts by the name of Furbush. "What, Bill Furbush?" asked the landlord. George did not know, but thought likely that might have been his name, as his son was called William. "Lud, yes," returned the landlord. "I knowed Bill Furbush well. He came here about the same time I did, he from Massachusetts and I from Vermont. But, poor feller, he was too weakly to bear much, and the first fever he took finished him up. His old woman was as clever a creature as ever was, but she had some high notions." "Did she die too?" asked George. Filling his mouth with an enormous quid of tobacco, the landlord continued, "No, but it's a pity she didn't, for when Bill and the boy died she went raving mad, and I never felt so like crying as I did when I see her a-tearing her hair and going on so. We kept her a spell, and then her old man's brother's girl came for her and took her off, and the last I heard the girl was dead, and she was in the poorhouse somewhere east. She was born there, I believe." "No, she warn't, either," said the landlady, who for some minutes had been aching to speak. "No, she warn't, either. I know all about it. She was born in England, and got to be quite a girl before she came over. Her name was Sarah Fletcher, and Peter Fletcher, who died with the cholera, was her own uncle, and all the connection she had in this country. But goodness sooth, what ails you?" she added, as Mary turned deathly white, while George passed his arm around her to keep her from falling. "Here, Suffreny, fetch the campfire, she's going to faint." But Mary did not faint, and after smelling the camphor, she said, "Go on, madam, and tell me more of Sarah Fletcher." "She can do it," whispered the landlord with a sly wink. "She knows everybody's history from Dan to Beersheby." This intimation was wholly lost on the good-humored hostess, who continued, "Mr. Fletcher died when Sarah was small, and her mother married a Mr. I don't justly remember his name." "Temple?" suggested Mary. "Yes, Temple, that's it. He was rich and cross, and broke her heart by the time she had her second baby. Sarah was adopted by her grandmother Fletcher, who died, and she came with her uncle to America." "Did she ever speak of her sisters?" asked Mary, and the woman replied, "Before she got crazy, she did. One of 'em, she said, was in the country somewhere, and t'other one she remembered the best, and talked the most about, lived in England. She said she wanted to write to him, but her uncle, he hated the Temples, so he wouldn't let her. And as time went on, she kinder forgot him, and didn't know where to direct, and after she took crazy she never would speak of her sisters or own that she had any." "Is Mr. Furbush buried near here?" asked George, and the landlord answered, "Little better than a stone's throw. I can see the very tree from here, and maybe your younger eyes can make out the graves. He ought to have a gravestun, for he was a good feller." The new moon was shining, and Mary, who came to her husband's side, could plainly discern the buckeye tree and the two graves where Willie and Willie's father had long been sleeping. The next morning, before the sun was up, Mary stood by the mounds where often in years gone by Sally Furbush had seen the moon go down and the stars grow pale in the coming day, as she kept her tireless watch over her loved and lost. "Willie was my cousin, your cousin," said Mary, resting her foot upon the bit of board which stood at the head of the little graves. George understood her wishes, and when they left the place, a handsome marble slab marked the spot where the father and his infant son were buried. Bewildered and unable to comprehend a word, Sally listened while Mary told her of the relationship between them. But the mists which for years had shrouded her reason were too dense to be suddenly cleared away. And when Mary wept, winding her arms around her neck and calling her aunt, and when the elegant Mrs. Campbell, scarcely less bewildered than Sally herself, came forward addressing her as sister, she turned aside to Mrs. Mason, asking in a whisper what had made them crazy. But when Mary spoke of little Willie's grave and the tree which overshadowed it, of the green prairie and cottage by the brook, once her western home, Sally listened, and at last one day, a week or two after her arrival in Boston, she suddenly clasped her hands closely over her temples, exclaiming, "It's come! It's come! I remember now! The large garden, the cross old man, the dead mother, the rosy-cheeked Ella I loved so well." "That was my mother, interrupted Mary. For a moment Sally regarded her intently, and then catching her in her arms, cried over her, calling her her precious child, and wondering she had never noticed how much she was like Ella. "And don't you remember the baby, Jane?" asked Mrs. Campbell, who was present. Perfectly, answered Sally. "He died, and you came in a carriage, but didn't cry. Nobody cried but Mary." It was in vain that Mary tried to explain to her that Mrs. Campbell was her sister, once the baby Jane. Sally was not to be convinced. To her, Jane and the little Alice were the same. There was none of her blood in Mrs. Campbell's veins, or why, said she, did she leave us so long in obscurity, me and my niece, Mrs. George Morland, Esquire? This was the title which she always gave Mary when speaking of her, while to Ella, who occasionally spent a week in her sister's pleasant home, she gave the name of Little Cipher, as expressing exactly her opinion of her. Nothing so much excited Sally or threw her into so violent a passion as to have Ella call her aunt. "If I wasn't her kin when I wore a sixpenny calico," said she, "I certainly am not now that I dress in purple and fine linen." When Sally first went to Boston, George procured for her the best possible medical advice, but her case was of so long standing that but little hope was entertained of her entire recovery. Still, everything was done for her that could be done, and after a time she became far less boisterous than formerly, and sometimes appeared perfectly rational for days. She still retained her taste for literature, and nothing but George's firmness and decision prevented her from sending off the manuscript of her grammar, which was now finished. It was in vain that he told her she was not now obliged to write for a living, and he had more than enough for her support. She replied it was not money she coveted, but reputation, a name, to be pointed at as Mrs. Sarah Furbush, authoress of Furbush's Grammar and Company. This was her aim. "You may write all you choose for the entertainment of ourselves and our friends," said George, "but I cannot allow you to send anything to a publisher." Sally saw he was in earnest, and at last yielded the point, telling Mary in confidence that she never saw anyone in her life she feared as she did Esquire Morland when he set his foot down. And George did seem to have a wonderful influence over her, for a single look from him would quiet her when in her wildest moods. In spite of the desire she once expressed of finding her sister, Mrs. Campbell's pride at first shrank from acknowledging a relationship between herself and Sally Furbush. But the fact that George Morland brought her to his home, treating her in every respect as his equal, and always introducing her to his fashionable friends as his aunt, gradually reconciled her to the matter, and she herself became at last very attentive to her, frequently urging her to spend a part of the time with her. But Sal always refused, saying that, for the sake of her niece, she must be very particular in the choice of her associates. True to her promise, on Mary's 21st birthday, Mrs. Campbell made over to her 1/4 of her property, and Mary, remembering her intentions towards William Bender, immediately offered him 1/2 of it. But he declined accepting it, saying that his profession was sufficient to support both himself and Jenny, for in a few weeks Jenny, whose father had returned from California, was coming, and already a neat little cottage a mile from the city was being prepared for her reception. Mary did not urge the matter, but many an article of furniture more costly than William was able to purchase found its way into the cottage, which, with its overhanging vines, climbing roses, and profusion of flowers, seemed just the home for Jenny Lincoln. And when the flowers were in full bloom, when the birds sung amid the trees, and the summer sky was bright and blue, Jenny came to the cottage, a joyous, loving bride, believing her own husband the best in the world, and wondering if there was ever anyone as happy as herself. And Jenny was very happy. Blithe as a bee, she flitted about the house and garden, and if in the morning a tear glistened in her laughing eyes as William bade her adieu, it was quickly dried, and all day long she busied herself in her household matters, studying some agreeable surprise for her husband, and trying for his sake to be very neat and orderly. Then, when the clock pointed the hour for his return, she would station herself at the gate, and William, as he kissed the moisture from her rosy cheek, thought her a perfect enigma to weep when he went away and weep when he came home. There was no place which Ella loved so well to visit, of where she seemed so happy, as at the cottage, and as she was of but little use at home, she frequently spent whole weeks with Jenny, becoming gradually more cheerful, more like herself, but always insisting that she should never be married. The spring following Mary's removal to Boston, Mrs. Mason came down to the city to live with her adopted daughter, greatly to the delight of Aunt Martha, whose home was lonelier than it was wont to be, for George was gone, and Ida, too, had recently been married to Mr. Elwood and removed to Lexington, Kentucky. And now a glance at Chicopee, and our story is done. Mr. Lincoln's California adventure had been a successful one, and not long after his return he received from George Morland a conveyance of the farm, which, under Mr. Parker's efficient management, was in a high state of cultivation. Among the inmates of the poorhouse, but few changes have taken place. Miss Grundy, who continues at the helm, has grown somewhat older and crosser, while Uncle Peter labors industriously at his new fiddle, the gift of Mary, who is still remembered with much affection. Lydia Knight, now a young lady of 16, is a pupil at Mount Holyoke, and Mrs. Perkins, after wondering and wondering where the money came from, has finally concluded that some of George's folks must have sent it. The end. End of Chapter 33. End of The English Orphans, or A Home in the New World, by Mary Jane Holmes.